We head down a darker path tonight. Before Australia's Stonehenge, Richard Patterson spent 20 years researching who he thinks is Jack the Ripper. When we sat down to do this one, I wasn't sure what to expect. I did delve into the serial killer genre and that twisted side of mentality many years ago, and it was interesting to observe where my mind was at as Richard was sharing his research, which culminated in a book, Jack the Ripper, The Works of Francis Thompson. It was a fascinating conversation. One of those ones where I'm not entirely sure how it went. So I'm going to listen back to this one along with you guys. And it is a departure from the usual stuff that we have out here at Unlocking the Code. However, when opportunity arises, you take it. And we must always examine all sides of the human existence, understanding that there is serial killers operating on every continent all the time to this day. I wasn't really sure what to do as far as music for this one. It's hard to pair a song to Jack the Ripper. So I'm going to read his poem, the one that we discuss, The Nightmare of the Witch Babies. I'm going to end with that before we get into this one. And look, after reading the full poem and after listening to Richard, I'm going to side with Richard. I think Francis Thompson was Jack the Ripper. However, what I didn't understand at the start of this conversation was the reverberation through time, and if it bleeds, it leads, started with Jack the Ripper, which is something that we still deal with to this day. It's interesting how things can have a reverberation through time. I recommend you buy Richard's book. You can find it at www.patestos.com. That's where you can order the book. It's also where you can find all of Richard's other work. Also found it on eBay in a paperback and on Amazon in Kindle. So make sure you give it a read. As I said, it's a bit of a darker subject. However, we've got to understand this. We've got to explore this. I don't have too much more with this one. It's a bit different. However, looking forward to listening back to it. I'm not going to say enjoy because of the subject matter. However, I hope this provides a different perspective. And speaking of different perspectives, The Nightmare of the Witch Babies. 2 witch babies, ha ha. 2 witch babies, ho ho. A Bedamon-ridden hag, with the devil pigged alone, begat them late at night on the bloody rusted stone. And they dwell within the land of the bare shank bone, where the evil goes to and fro. 2 witch babies, ho ho ho. A lusty knight, ha ha, on a swart steed, ho ho, rode upon the land where the silence feels alone, rode upon the land of the bare shank bone, rode upon the strand of the dead man's groan, where the evil goes to and fro. 2 witch babies, ho ho ho. A rotten mist, ha ha, like dead man's flesh, was abhorrent in the air, clung to a tether in the wood of the wicked-looking trees, was a scurf upon the flood, and the reeds they were pulpy with blood, 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 and the clouds were looming low. 2 witch babies, ho ho ho. No one life there, ha ha, no sweet life there, ho ho, but the long loud laugh and the short shrill howl and the quick brisk flip of the horned owl as he flits right past with his gloomy cowl through the murkiness long and low. 2 witch babies, ho ho ho. What it sees he, ha ha, is there in the frightfulness, ho ho. There he saw a maiden, fair as fair. Sad were her dusk eyes, long was her hair. Sad were her dreaming eyes, misty her hair, and strange were her garments flow. 2 witch babies, ho ho ho. Swiftly he followed her, ha ha. Eagerly he followed her, ho ho. From the rank the greasy sore red bubbles oozed and stood, till it grew a putrid slime, and where his horse has trod. The ground plashes with a wet too like to blood, and chilled terrors like a fungus grow, to which babies, ho ho ho. There stayed the maiden, ha ha, shed all her beauty, ho ho. She shred her flower of beauty, grew lately old and dire, was the demon-ridden witch, and the consort of hellfire. Am I a lovely noble knight? See thy heart's own desire. Now they come upon thee low, to which babies, ho ho ho. Into the fogginess, ha ha, lo she corrupted, ho ho. Comes there a death with the looks of a witch, and joints that creak like a night bird's scritch, and breath that smokes like the smoking pitch, and eyeless sockets aglow, to which babies, ho ho ho. Close behind it, ha ha, a close behind it, ho ho. Comes there a babe of bloated youth, with a curdled eye and a snaggy tooth, and a life no mortal dare speak its sooth, and its tongue like a worm doth show, to which babies, ho ho ho. Its paunch a swollen, ha ha, its life a swollen, ho ho. Like the hiatus stays drowned, harsh was its hum, and its paunch was rent like a Braston drum, and the blubbered fat from its belly doth come, with a sickening ooze, how made it so, to which babies, ho ho ho. It leaps on his charger, ha ha, it clasps him fondly, ho ho. Its joints are about him, its breast in his bones, its eyes glare in his, and it sucks up his groans. He hiatus from his horse, he burns on the stones, and his mail cracks off in a glow, to which babies, ho ho ho. Its tooth in his shoulder, ha ha, his skin dully champing, ho ho. Slime like a snail with that loathly thing, his own self writhed him with shuddering. His gaze grew dark and his soul took wing, while his breast still kept its flow, to which babies, ho ho ho. Hissed, hiss, a gloominess, ha ha, hissed, hissed, a something, ho ho. Away with a scream, the swart steed flew, the evil shadows, those ghostly two, and a hiatus slime kneaded with a sanguine dew into the dread slime below, to which babies, ho ho ho. To which babies, ha ha, to which babies, ho ho. The elder hath a name, and the name of it is lust, and the name of that its brother, its name is lust, disgust. They are ever in a land where the sun is dead with rust, so the scummy mist thickens below. Woe for the witch babies, woe, woe, woe. There where corruption alone doth grow, there still the evil goes to and fro. It is formless, nameless, vague, it is dread made palpable. None can paint its face, for none who behold it live to tell. 'Tis a shadow on the earth of the awful nether hell. It is nightmare, God made it so. Shun the land and shun the woman, shun the wicked spell, to which babies, woe, woe, woe. Welcome back, everyone. Tonight we head down a bit of a different path. Mr. Patterson is back with us again. However, before he discovered the Stonehenge documents that we've gone through a few times now, he delved into Jack the Ripper. How many years did you spend studying that, mate?
20 years.
Oh, welcome back, by the way.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me back, Triffin.
No.
Really glad to be back.
Did you just say 20 years?
Yeah, I spent 20 years researching this. In compared to that, Stonehenge is like nothing out of the amount of time.
Yeah.
You know, I spent maybe 3 years, 4 years on Stonehenge. 2
Yeah.
years maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Like real studying.
So 20 years. So what? So let's start back at the start, mate. What made you? I mean, obviously, I went through my own period of studying serial killers in some of the major cases. You know, Zodiac, Ted Bundy. You know, Jack the Ripper. Obviously, you know, understanding that there's always serial killers operating in every country, pretty much all the time to this day. However, why a 20-year dedication to that idea or to that path?
Because I wanted something once when I was really young, and it didn't come true, and it should have, because I was an idealist. And I thought to myself, maybe something happened in the past that stuffed everything up, and maybe my ideals are right. Maybe people's ideals are right. Maybe something really bad happened we don't know about. And yeah, and I thought something had happened about 100 years ago. I had this guess, this hunch that something had changed. We'd all sort of frozen in time, in not the best picture, the paradigm. And I wanted to see what had locked us into this paradigm. where we're not really free. And I found something that happened 100 years ago or 120 years ago.
Mm.
And I thought that could be it.
Well, you think Jack the Ripper reverberated through time, that experience, because that was what a lot of press was done on that at the time. It was mass hysteria.
Yeah, at the time it was very it was huge. It was like blockbuster proportions of when it came to what the general public was consuming in the press, but with no suspect that we know of, or with all the other suspects I know of, apart from Francis Thompson, my suspect. All you get is like an emitter from 1888 saying like a white dwarf saying this is an event that when we do cycle back to it and have remnants like any major event in our psyche, collective consciousness, our animus mundi. And I think that what you have with this event is that if it's Francis Thompson, is you get an emitter that doesn't just play it doesn't play, it plays in stereo. Okay. What I'm trying to say is that with Francis Thompson, because he was such a huge force in history, you now have an echo, like a beam, like a torchlight that's shining in another direction, providing this unknown influence of Jack the Ripper. I believe if Francis Thompson was Jack the Ripper, there's an influence on Jack the Ripper which is far greater than we realise, and it extends into the current.
Okay, that's very interesting. So, I mean, I remember when I was been thinking about it the last couple of days, because I know you were coming up, about what I remember about the Jack the Ripper cases that I've read about over the years. And the one that sticks out to me, and I think I read it at a formative age, probably pretty young, was that there was a diary found behind a cupboard or something like that, and it was some guy professing to be Jack the Ripper. Yeah,
I think that's about 20 years old, maybe 25 years old, actually longer.
And which would make sense, because that's probably about the time I read it. I probably found it in a clandestine spot or something like that.
At the time, it was all over the press that the diary of Jack the Ripper had been found, like the diary of Hitler.
Yeah.
It was a big... And anyway, the diary of Hitler was proven to be forged. The diary of James Maybrick, which is what this book purports to be, a rich Liverpool cotton merchant. The idea is that he wrote, he was Jack the Ripper, and he wrote the diary, and it was passed down, and one of his relatives gave it to a researcher, and that's how it came about. And the diary exists, and many tests have been done on the diary. It's inconclusive, the results on the test still.
Okay.
But the press said he was Jack the Ripper. So that was James Maybrick, and he looks like the typical Jack the Ripper. He's got a tall top hat, and that he's got that sort of caricature to him.
Yes.
And he was murdered by his wife, who poisoned him.
Was it with arsenic or something?
With arsenic.
Yeah,
that's right.
Yeah.
And my suspect, Francis Thompson, the editors who brought him off the streets when he lived in London. And who became his benefactors and best friends, and who became the subject of they became his subject of his will. So he was in great debt to these editors in his life, long-time friends. They held a fundraising party for Maybrick's wife, Florence Maybrick, who poisoned her husband, to raise money for her defence.
Yeah, right.
Now, see how I did that? That's why Francis Thompson has an impact to Jack the Ripper, and this will continue to happen. That weird synchronicity.
Yeah, right. So he was there a number of different times throughout the different theories that...
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Okay.
And not just that. I'm going to tell you his weird synchronicity.
Well, hang on, before we get there.
Yeah.
So I've had a flick through your book. I'm sure I read it. Every time I look at the words and stuff, I've picked it up somewhere before. However, Francis Thompson... tell us about Francis Thompson. Where did he grow up? Who is Francis Thompson?
Francis Thompson. I think the part that pertains to the crimes, I'll start there actually. Just before the crimes and during the crimes, he was living in the area. If you're asking, because I'm just talking about his life, he was living in the area. He was on drugs, actually withdrawing from drugs. So he was suffering what's called hyperesthesia, or I think it's the term where everything becomes vibrant, and everything becomes hypersensitive to you, and it's like you can suddenly snap awake, because he was constantly on laudanum for most of his life.
What is laudanum? Is that opiates or
it's heroin? It's
okay.
It's more morphine. I think it is. It's it's wine mixed with water. I mean, it's water mixed with opiate liquid, so the opium liquid, and it's sold in drams, and like 20 drams could kill you, and they sold it in about 40 dram bottles. Yeah, but there was always big strict warnings on laudanum not to overdose or the opium. So he'd mix it himself and drink it. So he drank it like a wine, but he was on heroin. Okay, but not during the crimes. During the crimes, he suddenly withdrew from 10 years of taking this stuff, and at the time of the crimes, he was in the East End. He was living about 100 metres away from where Mary Kelly, the final victim, was slaughtered. Yeah. And before her murders, over the months before her murders, he was living in various parts of the East End. He was carrying a dissecting scalpel, a general use dissecting scalpel, blade about longer than the average butter knife. And he knew how to use it well. He cut up 400 cadavers before arriving in the East End.
And what did you go to school, train as a surgeon, was he?
Yeah, that's right. He trained as a surgeon at Owens Medical College in Manchester between 1878 and 1884.
So he spent 6 years
there. Yeah, he spent 6 years. And it wasn't a normal medical school. It was a school that specialised in a new form of autopsy by a pathologist. It had been devised by a German pathologist, and it was very recent at the time by a man called Virchow. And he learnt pathological organ removal. Right. Because prior to that, you didn't remove organs during post-mortems. Okay. But he learned the radical new technique that just introduced in Germany. Only his school was teaching it, and his school specialised in using cadavers and physical work over textbook work. Okay. And it was considered one of the 5 best medical schools in the country. And he studied there for 6 years in surgery, working in the emergency ward.
Yeah, right.
As an intern and studying. Yeah.
So where did they get the cadavers from? Was it just people who died, or they just...
Yes, people who died naturally.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Anyway, so he's in the East End. He's got this knife from there. And he's looking for a prostitute that's left him, who fled him from the West End, and she fled to the East End. He was there looking for her. And in his pocket of his long coat, if you reach into one pocket, because this is what he was doing for his time apart from being homeless, he'd been homeless for 3 years. And if you ask him what he was doing for his time, he reached into one pocket and pulled out a poem, which is a poem which he just had sent to a publisher that his prostitute friend had found out before she fled him. And that poem talked about hunting down prostitutes and ripping their stomach open and pulling out their fetuses so it could snap their necks so more prostitutes wouldn't be born from the woman.
Seriously, that's what the poem was about?
Yeah, it was about a man who hunts through the streets of London with a knife, disemboweling women, so he could find fetuses to snap their necks. And the poem is called The Nightmare of the Witch Babies, and the poem has the narrator laugh all the way through it, ha 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 ha, as he slaughters all these women. And as he does so, he's at glee, because when he gets to the murder, the most brutal murder, he finds twins, unborn twins, and he talks about the relish should be able to snap the necks of these whores, would-be whores. And yeah, that was his poem. And she'd read that, let me rephrase that. She was illiterate, couldn't read it, but she found out what it was about after it got sent to a publisher, right? Who did not publish it because it was so foul, and the publisher's wife.
So how do we know what that's what the poem said?
Because I've read the poem, because it's in my book, because it is found in the archives. When I did my 20 years research, part of where I went was Boston College in the USA, and where Francis Thompson wrote all this down, and he kept notebooks on him at the time, and the notebooks survived, most of them, after he was rescued from the streets of 1888. So he's in the East End. He's got in one pocket a notebook that has that poem, and in his other pocket he's got an unpublished short story, the only short story he ever wrote in his life, even though he was a prolific poet. And that story is about a poet who kills a woman with a knife. So he become famous through it and become a famous poet. And Francis Thompson became a world famous poet after the murders. But at the time, no one even knew who he was. Most people thought he was dead.
So how did he become famous after the murders?
Well, what happened was about a week after the murders, the editor who he'd sent the poems to rescued him from the streets, and they took him to a sanitarium to recuperate from exhaustion, and then they sent him to a monastery in Wales, and he spent 2 years there on the top floor of a walled male-only monastery that had guard dogs. And that's where he wrote the short story about hunting down a woman, killing her, so he became a famous poet, that coincidentally was written by a man who wasn't known as a poet at the time and became a famous poet.
So what other poems did he write? He obviously didn't always write about... Did he always write about dark stuff?
No,
his poetry?
Not at all. He was a brilliant poet. He was a genius. He wrote beautiful poetry. What was published by that editor was called The Passion of Mary. And so what happened is basically... do you mind me telling me how the editor got the poem published?
Yeah.
Okay, so Francis Thompson, he was... Prior to 1888, when he was living in the West End, he was living at the prostitute who fled him, who left him her apartment.
After finding the nasty poem.
Yeah. Before finding the nasty poem, or before her read and understand what the poem said, because she didn't, as I said, she was most likely illiterate. Before her discovery of the poem, he was living with her in her apartment in Chelsea, and he lived with her and they had sexual relations, and this had happened for a year. And during that time, she urged him to send poetry off to publishers.
Yeah.
And he did, to one. And that publisher read the number of the witch babies for this, and his wife wrote that on the letter, like when they stowed it away, she wrote, the detestable witch poems which I hate. And it had in that her just putting it down to opium use. Like obviously someone on drugs sent this to us.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And basically what happened is Francis Thompson, after his girlfriend, who was a prostitute, said, look, send something, you got to send something, we can't live like this. And she found him on the streets. What happened was that he sent it to the publisher with a letter, and the letter said, here's some poetry and a few essays, and if you don't like it, throw it in the bin, that's fine with me, I'm going to kill myself if you don't publish it. And then what happened was the editor got the envelope that had lawn stains all over it, thought this is pretty gross, and was busy and put it in a pigeonhole, planning to open up later, but he didn't. And Francis Thompson tried to commit suicide, and he went to a rubbish dump in Covent Garden, a vegetable rubbish dump, and he sat on top of the pile of veggies and had laudanum in his pocket, and he had that 40 grams, enough to kill 2 people, and he swallowed the first half and then was about to swallow the second half to kill himself. And while he's doing this, his letter sitting in a pigeonhole didn't get open for a year. And Francis Thompson, he says he was about to take the second half of the opium, which would have killed him outright, when he felt a hand on his shoulder, and it was a ghost. And it was a ghost of a poet, a young poet who committed suicide at the age of 14 called Thomas Chatterton. And the ghost told him, do not kill yourself, you have a special mission on earth.
Right.
Hold your life. And Francis Thompson didn't take the second half, and the next day found out he was published.
Yeah, right. So what led him to, do we know what his fascination is? What led him to the surgeon school?
Because his mother said he had to get a job or she'd kick him out of the house.
Right, and he just found that. And
she got it for him.
Yeah.
Her husband, his father was a doctor.
Oh, okay. So there's the medicals in the family.
Yeah. But people think because the father was a doctor and a homeopathic doctor, that he was one who urged Francis Thompson to become a doctor. But no, he wanted his son to be a priest.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. Did he enter into the priesthood at all?
Yeah, he started as the age of 10 and went all the way to the age of 18. And the priest said that he was, they said he was a genius. They said they see nothing like him at the college. Out of the, I think the numbers were 4,500 students that were attending at the time when he studied at Usher College to become a priest. And he'd gone through all the ceremonies beforehand. He just had to do the final priest.
Get the nod sort of thing.
That's right. Out of the 40,000 students or so, they had 21 competitive exams in English, and he won 16 of them. And they'd said they'd never seen anything like him. He knew several languages by the age of 14, classical Greek and French and Latin and German, Yeah, he was. Yeah, he
So
was
there's an obsessiveness there. It sort of sounds like as well. Like he was obviously very concentrated in that. Why didn't he take the final exam? Do we know why he didn't become a priest?
Yeah, because he kept on setting churches on fire, and it was a bad look.
Yeah, right. So there was burnings back in the day. Is that what's the?
Oh, he'd set churches on fire.
Oh, he'd set churches on fire.
He'd set churches on fire, and that was a bad. They didn't think that was a great thing for when they thought he could be anything in the priesthood. He could have gone anywhere in the clergy. He was that smart, but they didn't like the idea that he'd like to set fire to churches. But they put it down officially as him being idolent, like lazy.
He was lazy, so he burned down churches. So did anyone die in these fires? Or
no, but got in the newspaper once, and he almost injured a few people.
And how many churches did he burn down?
We know of two. There was a few other things he burnt, which I'll go into if you want to know. It's very interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because I'm trying to build a character of this guy.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay, the first time he set a church on fire, this will give you an idea of his character.
Can I nick that lighter off you, mate, before you continue the story?
Yeah.
It's there somewhere.
Sure.
Trying to find it. So he set churches on fire. So there's a disturbed individual living inside that guy's head. It seems from a young age, but also obsessive about education and or whatever he picked up.
Okay, what did I'll just jump in? I'll jump in to explain something about his psyche before I talk about the church fires.
Sure.
These are about some other churches that got caught on fire. So what happened was when he was about 9 years old, an agitator, an anti-Catholic agitator, Protestant Catholic agitator, anti-Catholic agitator called William Murphy arrived nearby town. He couldn't come in the town because people thought he was going to get attacked or arrested.
And as an agitator, what agitating?
He was saying that the Catholics eat babies in their masses and their black masses, and they're cannibals and Satanists, and the Pope's evil, the Antichrist. And
yeah, right. Well, it still goes on till today too, doesn't it?
There's nothing. That's what I'm saying. That's the point about something really bad happened that locked us into a weird thing.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so William Murphy comes to town saying, "Look, we've got to kill them all," and so a riot took place. And hundreds and hundreds of Protestants went down Francis Thompson Street where he lived. They scalped one man in the street that he was in. They shot and killed a couple of others. They ransacked the streets that they lived in, pulled all the bedding out and ripped everything to shreds at every house and set houses on fire.
So why? Because that was a Catholic area? Or?
Yeah. It was Francis Thompson was born in Preston, Lancashire, which is a Catholic stronghold.
Yeah,
it's very pro-Catholic and it's got a long tradition. Preston means priest town. It's Catholic bastion area. And at the time, his family had friends and quite sociable. But then they moved from Preston to Ashton-under-Lyne outside Manchester, which was a very Protestant city. But Ashton-under-Lyne had a small area of Catholics about. There were 7 Catholic priests for the whole of Ashton, the town. And Francis Thompson's family only dealt with them. Francis Thompson's family only had Catholic priests as friends. No one else entered the house. All Francis Thompson saw were Catholic priests.
Right, okay.
And then what happened?
There's an influence on that during your childhood then, isn't there?
Well, when the riot took place, the Catholic priests after the riot had to flee the town. And Francis Thompson's family were cut off from everyone during the reign of the time there. In the riots, they said that they burnt a church down, the rioters, and Francis Thompson's family hid in another church, and they surrounded it and shots were shot into the church, and people people were injured, and the only person there who could amputate was his father.
Right.
And it's a small church, and its fires burning all around, and the army had to be called in. It took 5 days to stop the rioting.
Really?
And yeah, it was really big. It was called
this is the
Manchester Protestant riots happening.
Oh, I've heard of that. Yeah, right. Okay.
The Manchester riots.
I've heard about that. The Manchester riots. Yeah, right. So he's subjected to burning churches and what he did, dissecting bodies at a very young age.
He's in a church that was about to burn down after the other church was burned to the ground. And he was there with his father, who was basically amputating people. And remember, there's no anaesthetics back then, painkillers.
No, bite on this.
Yeah. And if he was going to ask anyone to help, his son wouldn't have been far away.
Yeah.
And anyway, that's when Thompson first read the Apocalypse. he grabbed the Bible and he flicked to the page that he thought had made most sense to what was going on around him, and that's when he realised the Antichrist existed.
Okay, right. In during that trauma, so basically, then you're setting up. If that happened at a formative age, you're setting up the exact manifestation of what he ended up doing.
Well, then, so back to the churches that he set on fire. So the first church he set on fire, so I'll jump in before I forget, is that he was about 13, returned back from school to town, and he wanted to wear, because he'd been studying as a priest, when he did the Sunday Mass at town during the summer holidays, he wanted to wear the purple robes, which you only wear when you're a full priest.
Right.
But he was only, like I said, about 13. And they said he couldn't. And so what he did is he snuck up and took it, and he was sitting in his seat. He first was sitting on the pew with everyone else where he was meant to sit. He was meant to help the thurifier, a guy who swings a little chalice, and basically just follows him around. He thought he was more important than that, and he wanted to be a priest. So he quickly jumped from his chair, stole the purple robe, started to light the candles, which the priest does, and he did it so hastily, he set the curtains on fire above the candles, and it suddenly blared through the church. And remember, these people have seen Catholic churches burn down before, and they flee and go on the papers. And they took. But the thing is, when they cleaned up the mess and were putting the fires out, Francis Thompson had sat back in his chair as if nothing had happened.
So he was sitting there just watching the fires,
watching them put. The maids and people come and all put get rid of the cinders and stuff, and restock the candles and do all that. The second fire he caused, he got the thurible himself, the one that you swing, but instead of swinging it gently, he swung it over his head so fast it burst into flame like a meteor. And he let it go into the crowd.
Right.
And that caused a fire in the church, even though the churches. But there were hot cinders scattered everywhere, and that was a danger. But he did cause fires after the murders, but I won't go into that unless you want to know, because you might more want to know about his past and what may have triggered him.
Yeah, well, I'm just trying to build a character. I mean, so do you think as well that the fact that he got into the papers may have fed his writing and wanting to be published again as well, if you think about that? I mean, being in the seeing your name in the paper for whatever reason, there's no such thing as bad publicity. Maybe that fed into something at a young age as well.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I'd agree.
Yeah, right. So he's imprinted at a young age in a church, burning around him, and he's imprinted with dissecting or taking parts from people's bodies.
Yep.
And so they didn't allow him to be a priest because of these incidents. Was there only the two, or was there more than that?
There was more than that.
Is there any of them of significance worth mentioning, or?
No.
No? Okay.
No, I don't think so. But there were more than that. He had a very interesting schoolhood.
Yeah, right.
And there were several instances which are emeritus, but, they're in my book.
Yeah.
Yeah. But there's more interesting things to talk about, I would say.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough.
But if you want to ask other more instances in his childhood which may have framed his adulthood, there are plenty of big ones.
Yeah, well, give us a couple of those and we might move forward.
You reached a majority of age when you were 21, 1988, or actually in the 1900s, and still is, I think, or at least in the USA. But anyway, back then, you were an adult when you were 21. The day before he turned 21, his mother died of a long illness, and he wrote about that. And if you want to hear it, I can read it out to you, but I have to pause to get the page. But it's a very gruesome poem about the death of his mother. And then he was also angered by the fact that his father planned to remarry a girl younger than him. Yeah, right. And that was the cause of the argument that made him flee his home and flee to London, because he was so irate that his father would dare to remarry a Catholic. And he, basically wrote a poem about that described the stepmother as a wicked woman who decapitated him. And he describes his head rolling down a hill, and says how she drank all his blood from a dish and called her a witch. It's quite a gruesome poem, and he wrote that about that. He had yeah, he had a few deaths in the family as well. His sister died in infancy under his care. He had a twin who was born with him dead, strangled.
Yeah, right. By the umbilical cord, or
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
His name Thompson means Francis Thompson. Thompson means twin.
Oh, okay. Right. That's interesting. That's very fascinating. So was he expecting to get into the priesthood? Was that another moment of trauma? Or
Yeah, that was a huge moment. He really expected to get into. The relationship between him and priests with them was very different. He, apart from one occasion, he didn't actually have anything to do with the priesthood after he left Manchester, and he. They said there's something wrong with him. There's something wrong between him and the priests, was what was said afterwards. There was a falling out that was never repaired, apart from one encounter in the future after the murders.
Yeah, right. So, obviously being the priesthood, they didn't release exactly what happened and why he didn't take that final step.
No,
because what stays within the clergy stays
well,
within the clergy.
They said he got glowing reports all the way through to the last year.
Yeah, right.
Academically, just brilliant.
Yeah, right.
Not very good at maths.
Okay, interesting. And he spends 6 years at this school. Is that an abnormal long time to spend at that school?
Yeah, he failed 3 times. He was meant to do the first year, which is the physical stuff, how to actually cut into bodies, and then he was meant to 2 years until you get to the cell theories and all the pathology and all the science behind it. He kept on but every year when you pass and do the Hippocratic Oath, he would fail the exams on purpose. He'd go to London to do the exams and go to a museum instead. And when he'd go back home, the father would say, "How'd you go?" And he'd say, the son would just say, "I have failed." Nothing more was that question. And then finally they sent him on the third occasion, they sent him to where was it? To Glasgow to do an examination there because they were easier to pass, and he just didn't turn up and do them. Another time he went to the opera.
Yeah, right.
And his parents were paying for this.
The whole time.
Yeah, 6 years. And so all he learned over and over again was the radically new techniques of removing body organs.
So he did the practical over and over again.
And he spent more money. He spent £20 a year extra. And his mother actually asked him what a number of corpses you're cutting up. He was spending like 3 times the amount on the extra corpses. He was cutting bodies when the lights are out.
Right. Wow. Like yeah. So for 6 years, that's all he did, and then he decided to. What did he get kicked out eventually, or?
Yeah, what happened eventually was his mother said, "We can't pay for this." This is his stepmother, the wicked stepmother to him, said, "We can't pay for you. Get a job."
Yeah.
So, where would you think if you're going to write okay, guess what job he had? I'm not trying to. Do you want to know what job he got?
A butcher?
No, that would be good. But how about this? A medical instrument factory on the conveyor belt, where he's just checking the quality of dissecting scalpels going past over and over again.
Oh, so he's just watching blades go in front of him over and over and over and over.
A big mechanised, systematic machine, a big industrial revolution machine, just pumping out dissecting scalpels for him, and his job was to throw out the bad ones. Now he got the scalpel that he got was he stayed as a doctor for 6 years, and it could have just been a memento from that. We could have got from the medical factory, but he got fired. And then he tried to sell the Encyclopedia Britannica, but he read it instead, and he had the speed. I think he could read 380 words a second.
Yeah, right.
So a page a second. And he read the Britannica instead of selling it, and he didn't make any money. Then he got a job. No, then he tried to join the army, and he spent just the practicing area where you do the bayoneting, and then he got kicked out. And then then that's when he left for London to become a famous poet.
Right. So what do we know why he got kicked away from the scalpel factory? I mean,
no.
Yeah. But he just loved bayoneting the dummies.
Yeah.
In the army.
Yeah.
Okay, so was this stuff that, I mean, obviously you spent 20 years on this, so there's an immense amount of knowledge. Was he a suspect at the time? Why not?
Because when the police would stop him on the side of the street and they're looking for a foreign sailor or big butcher guy, tattoos or Russian or Jewish butcher or whatever, they see this, timid guy who speaks very well, who's homeless and, looks disheveled. No one would want to go near him, of course. And when they say, "What's in your pockets?" and he says, "All some poems." Oh, okay, and they give it back to him because you're a police officer. You're not expected to know what poetry, to read poetry, let alone write it. And then if they ask him why you've got a razor-sharp dissecting scalpel, he'd say, "Oh, that's because I need it to shave with."
Yeah, right.
So, and if they said, "Why are you in the East End?" he'd say, "I'm hunting down a prostitute who left me because I love her. That's why I hang around the prostitutes."
Right. And what is there? So did they pull him up? Is there a record of him actually them asking him anything?
No. Oh, yes, there is. Sort of. What happened was, so London, where the murders occurred, they mainly happened around an area called Whitechapel, which was outside the city. But one of the murders occurred in the city precinct, so different police forces were involved at one time, which was the city police.
Different county or whatever.
Different county, yeah. So when the head of that county, Major Henry Smith, he talked about suspect they found in Haymarket, an area central to the London area, Piccadilly area, near the Thames, and that suspect, they said, though he gave an alibi without a shadow of doubt, whatever he said convinced the two police officers, the two detectives, he's innocent. And at the time, Francis Thompson was living in Haymarket, and he was living in Patterson Street. He was there at a shoe shop. Right. That was the only job he got really when he was in London during the 3 years he was homeless. And at the time, and when the police questioned this suspect, they questioned him, and they said they questioned him in Rupert Street. And Rupert Street and Penn Street are the same street. They just changed names. They're two very short streets. Right. And they said the suspect in Rupert Street, they said they thought he was Rupert because he was an ex-medical student, had been sent to had a medical breakdown, and what the weird thing was, they said about him that the reason they questioned this medical student who'd had a breakdown, who was living in Rupert Street, a young guy, was that he was apparently getting prostitutes by getting copper coins and polish them till they look like they're more expensive, like silver, like farthings. He was tricking the prostitutes and giving them false coins. Right. Gold. So they meant cheap coins, which looked expensive, and that's how he got known by the prostitutes. He was sneaky, and. Coincidentally enough, Francis Thompson, when he was homeless, said he was walking on the street one day, homeless, no money, and then a copper coin fell at his foot, and he put it in his pocket, and for some reason he turned around and walked back, and as he walked back, the other copper coin fell down onto the ground on the road, and he picked it up again, and he said, later on they said, I would have given him the first copper coin, but I figured I'd sort of deserve it, and it's just a copper, I'm not going to find the owner. But when the second one came, he tried to find the owner, but couldn't find the owner. It seemed to just fall out of the sky magically. And they even called it, the name of this incident, he called the miracle of the halfpennies, because he put both halfpennies in his vest pocket, kept on walking, and then for some reason he thought, I think they're gold, and he pulled them out, and they were gold, which was like sort of like $500, instead of $1. And that windfall suddenly helped him at one of the tough times just before the murders occurred. And he had money now. So it's coincidental that when the police questioned a suspect in Rupert Street, they described it as ex-medical student, as Francis Thompson had a mental breakdown, as Francis Thompson had, because that's why he left medical school. Sorry, I didn't mention the mental breakdown. No, yeah. His mum had it when his mum died. Yeah. The year after his mum died, he had a medical breakdown. Right. A mental breakdown, at the medical school. That was the reason why he left, but he couldn't sustain the workload. Yeah. So there was that too. So it's coincidental that both things matched Francis Thompson, but also the police pulled up this suspect because of a halfpenny change in value. Yeah. When the big event Francis Thompson said he was living in that area was the shiny coins. Yeah. But no, to answer your question, no, Francis Thompson never was a suspect. No one ever questioned him.
Right. Who were the actives? Because I mean, if you look back to the time, it was unsolved, wasn't it? Was it deemed unsolved?
It was closed in 1892. 4 years after the murders, they closed the case as unsolved, and it just said victim, someone, whoever did it was murder or murderers unknown.
Right.
That's all they could write.
Wow. I mean, yeah. Wow. Where do you go from there? I mean,
Well, my question is this. I'll jump in.
Yeah.
You remember you brought up Maybrick and the diary? Well, you brought up the diary.
Yeah.
And people go, wow, it had to be Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
When people say that, they go, it had to be Prince so-and-so. When I ask this question, what evidence do you have apart from the story that there could be the Ripper?
Yeah.
Out of everyone else in the world at the time,
True.
And then they go, like people say, oh, it's the Queen's doctor. And then you ask them, what evidence? They go, oh, I never actually read any evidence. But with my guy, I'm just telling. All I have to do is tell you what happened. Exactly what happened.
Yeah. I mean, if you presented that evidence to, well, actually, you have presented that evidence over in England, haven't you?
Yeah.
So, what's the take over there as far as?
They say that he didn't commit the murders. Most say he didn't because he didn't want to.
But that was his existence for, like if what you just explained to me is the character of a man that had deep trauma who was...
But the character of the man is why I wrote my book, because until my book, the character of the man was a pious Catholic who was in the East End, refused to leave the streets of London for fame and fortune because he wanted to wait to find his prostitute and rescue her.
Right.
And he loved her, and he always regretted never seeing her again.
Do you think maybe he saw her again?
I think he killed her.
Do you think... Because it's 5, is it 5 or 6?
Yeah, but I don't think there were five canonical murders.
Yeah.
But I think that his girlfriend, who was murdered by him, I believe, I speculate, wasn't one of the Ripper victims, was a totally separate murder.
Right.
Yeah.
But that might have wet his whistle, so to speak.
I think he wet his whistle, if you're going to use a term, with there were the 5 canonical murders, but there was one murder that occurred beforehand. Her name was Martha Tabarin, and people put her out of the canonical 5 because the wounding wasn't exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
And the way she was killed was 39 wounds, stabs with a penknife, and one major thrust with a bayonet.
Right. Which sort of sounds a bit like what he was doing on the fields before he tried to join the army.
He trained to use the bayonet, and the pen is mightier than the sword, and he was a writer, and the murders that she was stabbed with a penknife. But
yeah, right.
But I believe that was the whistle before he began the ritual, the actual purpose of what he was doing, the motive behind it. I think that was to make sure he was capable of launching into being the Ripper.
I mean,
but the murder of the prostitute, I think, was a totally different.
Yeah, right.
Agenda.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, there's revenge in the. If he did find her, I suppose, and that was what he was doing. So, how many successful is there any of his poems that are still mainstream today? That if anyone likes, because the name does ring a bell. That might be why the name rings a bell, because I don't mind poetry. Is there anything, because he did become a famous poet. He went to Boston. Is that what you said in the end?
No. His works went to Boston. But he never left England.
Okay.
He's the most anthologized. I never say the word properly. Most anthologized, the most written about poet in the English language. Like if you get a book on, even though you won't find a book on Francis Thompson, if you go to any library and get a big book on poetry, you'll find Francis Thompson.
Right.
He's in most books on poetry books than anyone, ever. Yeah. He's known as, some people have written him down as being the greatest modern poet ever.
Right.
And he's definitely recognized as the greatest modern Catholic poet ever. Like, there's no Catholic poet by the Catholic Church better than Francis Thompson.
So you said the publisher picked him up off the street.
Oh yeah, because a poem that he liked. So what happened was that, just to get back to the letter, and it sat in the pigeonhole for a year, And then the publisher was about to throw it in the fire and burn it when, as a joke, he opened up and started to read the poem, the first poem, and it's called The Passion of Mary. And he wrote it, he started to read it out to his family as a joke. Look at this fool. Because he'd also read the bit that said, Francis Thompson said, look, sorry about how disgusting this letter is and my condition. I'm like a Shakespearean villain. But here's my stuff. I hope you like it. If you don't, I'll kill myself, but don't mind me. And so the editor read it and thought he was dead, and then was just going to burn it. And he went in as a joke, to say, look at this fool who died. Ha ha. He started to read the poem out loud to his family. And as he read The Passion of Mary, as he read it, he realised, he was struck because he realised, oh my God, this guy's a genius.
Yeah, right.
And the poem, The Passion of Mary, was about the concept of getting Mary and putting her on the cross and crucifying her at the 5 wounds of Christ, so she'd be resurrected.
Right. So more murder of women, basically, mate, as well. But in a Catholic context, I suppose. So it's about.
But the thing is, he wasn't actually Catholic because his baptism was wrong. They spelled his name wrong. So, in strictly speaking, he wasn't Catholic, even though he was the greatest Catholic poet.
Right. Did the church have anything to do with his rise to fame, or?
No, but he did rise to fame enough to have to give only one confession after the murders, and that was to the Archbishop of England, the highest Catholic in the land, was who he gave his confession to after the crime. So he did have the year of the highest Catholics in the country.
So why? How come he only had to give one confession? What explain that?
Oh, he didn't have to give any confession, but he never had anything to do with the church per se. Like but took in church services after 1888. But he did know many Catholic priests. He was sent to a priory straight after the murders. Well, 6 weeks after the murders, and that was owned by Franciscan monks. But they were French, but he spoke the language.
Yeah.
But they didn't speak to him, pretty much. They left him alone. And that was the routine. He spent most of his life in different Catholic monasteries owned by different, like Dominicans at one or whatever from another, different orders. And where he wrote most of his poetry. He spent most of his life outside London, housed in male-only country, remote monasteries.
Right. Why?
I believe because it was easier for them to be sure he wouldn't kill again.
So you think that they knew?
I think his editors knew.
Yeah, right.
But felt responsible.
Yeah, right. You think the editors who released his poetry in the past, after rereading this, The Nightmare Witch or whatever it is, they think they put it together.
Yeah. And that's when the editor wrote the Dear Boss letter, I believe. The most famous, the one, Jack the Ripper is called Jack the Ripper because the letter was sent to the press that was signed Jack the Ripper, and that threatened to kill more women, and that's where the word we get. And before that, the murder was called Leather Apron in the press, and then it became Jack the Ripper. But that Dear Boss letter that was purportedly written by Jack the Ripper, some people think could be written by anyone. Some people think most people think was written by Jack the Ripper. And the police did, certainly at the time. But I believe it was actually the editor who wrote that letter. And I think he wrote that letter to get Francis Thompson's attention, to make him alert that I know your history, i.e. medical student, and I know you're there. Yeah. And I've got your poem. Get here and don't do anything stupid.
Right.
But unfortunately, Francis Thompson turned up and then went out back to the streets and did something stupid. Yeah. And by then, before they discovered him, he was in ragtags, barefoot, looking like gaunt and shabby, bearded. After they'd finished with him and put him back on the streets at the start of the first murders in August, he was now wearing a clean new suit, big long coat. He was cleanly shaven, had been well fed, and been bathed at their house.
Right,
and had money in his pocket.
So the editors picked him up before the murders took place.
Yeah. What happened was Francis Thompson. The letter goes out to the press. Francis Thompson rocks up to the editor's apartment, building, and goes in, and they speak, and then disappears again, and then comes back, and doesn't talk about the prostitute and that he's looking for. Just says, I'm too shy to be taken in. They said, we'll get you a house, we'll get you off the streets. He's refused. No, I want to stay. And it wasn't until they said October that he realised he couldn't find his prostitute friend, that he gave up walking the streets. So from August to October, they say. But then we know he's admitted just in November the 15th to the private hospital. So they basically got him ready for the murders unknowingly.
You're right.
And to them, because they were famous, they were well known. The editor knew the Prime Minister and knew the
which paper was this?
The editor, it was called the Merry England. It was a periodic journal of Catholic poetry and essays, progressive modernist outlook about bringing back the old days, getting back to the medieval sense of jolly old England.
Yeah, right.
Yeah,
isn't that interesting? That sort of the good old days. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and but this guy Wilfred Meanall, the editor who owned the magazine, was well known in the publishing industry. Was great, very influential, and knew everyone. Or half of basically, if you're famous, there's a wonderful chance you were good friends with him. He knew, all the opposition leaders, all the head of people. His wife was going to be almost just missed out on being poet laureate to the Queen.
Right,
they were up there.
They were up there in there.
Yeah, his wife's. She may have been the illegitimate daughter of Charles Dickens.
Okay.
Yeah, there was.
So was the Nightmare poem and the Passion of Mary in the same envelope?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. But the first one they published was the Passion of Mary.
Yeah.
And did he gain some notoriety? Was that before the murders or was that after?
Before the murders.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. Funny enough, at the month of the murder, not November, he didn't get anything published until then. November he came back and they published an essay, and the essay was a critic of Paul Bunyan, a Protestant poet.
Yeah.
Just saying it's a very dull poem. And in that he said, and it's in my book, so it says I'm only misquoting, but he basically describes the way he criticises him, the way using words that a dissector would use. He says you get the scalpel and you nick every nerve and vein of him. So he talks about basically dissecting him.
Right.
And funny enough, or not funny enough, actually grotesquely enough, Mary Kelly, the victim who was 100 metres away from where he lived at the time, in the 2 weeks he was living there, and she died within the 2 weeks he was there, living near in a refuge, she was horribly mutilated with a knife.
Yeah.
So badly that her partner had to only identify when they basically brought a plate with her eyeballs and her ears and said, "Is this your wife?" Or your partner? And he said, "Yeah, I recognise the eyes."
Yeah, right.
It took surgeons 6 hours to put her back together again. I could describe the wounds if you would like me to.
No, I think we don't need to go into that sort of detail.
And Thompson's poem essay, which I've quoted in there, actually describes a dissection. Like I nicked the muscle of his, and he describes it admirably how well a dissector can do it.
Well, you got to remember that, this guy for however many years just dissected.
Well, not only that, but learned to subdue people, because what would happen is he worked in an emergency room where people would come in, they'd have to cut off limbs. Those people wouldn't be drunk enough or be beaten unconscious enough to take that. So they'd struggle and they had to be strapped on the gurneys while he assisted the amputations and during those 6 years. But what they would do was a technique at Manchester Hospital where he studied. It was called Owen's Infirmary at the time, but now it's Manchester General Hospital today. It was a ligature strangulation that would cut off the blood supply to the head, so the person would just lapse into unconscious, and he perfected that, or used it for 6 years. And he was known as the necktie poet and had a little necktie, the long rope-like thing, with a little clasp.
Yeah.
That's what he wore. That's what he's known as the necktie poet, as a nickname after the murders. And all the Ripper victims, he haven't asked me much about the crime, so I didn't want to delve into it, but they were all strangled before being eviscerated.
Yeah, right. And in that manner as well, or was it
a cord, a ligature, something? They didn't say necktie, but something like rope-like.
Yeah. So basically, put them to sleep, and then
some suggested scarf, but something thin. Yeah, they'd be basically brought unconscious quite rapidly from behind, and then they'd be laid flat on the ground, and then operated on. Stabbed.
Operated on. Well, yeah. Is there a difference in his mind? That's the interesting thing, isn't it?
That's if he's Jack the Ripper.
Mm. Well, I mean, it sounds fairly bloody likely, mate. You know, like I think it's you know, I do remember because obviously the police reports and if you like the notoriety that Jack the Ripper got during that time, I mean, the entire of London was gripped in fear, wasn't it? It wasn't just the East End. Like, they thought it was, you know. And how long did it go on for?
3 months, autumn of 1888,
Yeah.
October, August until November.
Yeah.
No, yeah, but August the 31st.
Yeah.
So end of August. So September, October, November. But no murders in October.
Yeah, right. So it was only September, November.
Yep.
And where was
August the 31st. So you got that.
Yeah, so the 31st.
In September. I can go through the murders if you want to know quickly. Whatever I know.
Oh, look, I
so
think
much
maybe let's look. We're down the rabbit hole, mate. So refresh us. So who was the first one?
Okay, the first murder was a woman, and her name was Marianne Nichols, and she was killed on Bucks Row near Whitechapel Station, and she was killed on August the 31st about 4:30 a.m.
Mm-hmm. And she was the first of the dissections?
Well, no. When they first found her, they thought it was suicide because when the police arrived, they saw that she had her throat slashed, but they thought she killed herself and someone just taken the knife. There was no reason to kill her. There was no reason. When in 1888, you didn't kill a stranger who was poor.
Yeah.
It didn't happen. There was no reason. So they just figured she'd killed herself. And it wasn't until she was brought back to the mortuary that when they undressed her, they realised she'd been disemboweled. They saw it was a murder, and they thought it was just a freak event.
Yeah, right. So she had her insides taken out, basically.
Yeah, her intestines were protruding.
Yeah, right. And the second one? Who was the second one?
The second one was a woman called Annie Chapman. And Annie Chapman was killed in the back of 29 Hanbury Street, not too far from the main old markets, vegetable markets of Spitalfields. And she was disemboweled, her throat had been cut, her intestines had been placed over her left shoulder.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, yeah. And then the third one was... there's coming back to me now.
The third one was Catherine Eddowes, and she was... Elizabeth Stride, and she was killed in Durwood Street, or it's actually a very narrow street near at the Gentlemen's Club, which was a socialist gentlemen's club, and she was found. Her throat had been slashed, but she was still alive. Her eyes were still moving, so he didn't have time to do much more because he was disturbed by a horse and a cart driver. The horse freaked out when it came across the dead body or dying woman, so he didn't have a chance to do any more mutilations apart from cutting her throat.
So did the horse driver see anybody or not?
Sorry, that was in Bernard Street. I said Durwood Street, but I was wrong. What was that? Sorry.
Did the horse rider or driver see anything? Did someone flee the scene?
They didn't see anyone. Just the horse reacted.
Yeah, right. And the last one was...
The second last one of that night, it was a double murder that night, was about half an hour later, and it occurred in...
That's right, because they reckon because he got interrupted, so he went again.
Yeah, and this one, Mitre Square, he spent had a lot more time. He had 15 minutes, so he managed to cut patterns under her eyelids and symbols and disembowel her quite profusely. Scatter remains quite far wide of that area. Yeah,
what symbols did he use? Was it any sort of...
Yeah, he... It was a infinity symbol type shape that came from. So basically, what it served to not get too into the occult side of it was like a runway for her spirit. Okay. It was like basically an infinity symbol, 2 V's cut under her eyelids each.
Yeah, right.
And that was there was a lot of work done on that. That's when the police began to really freak out. And then the final murder was Mary Kelly, and that happened November the 9th. The double murder happened on September the 30th, and the August 31st was the first murder, and September the 8th was the one with Annie Chapman. So Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes is a double murder, and the final murder, Mary Kelly, on November the 9th. So quite a few weeks between the double and the final murder, so the public was a little bit at ease, sort of calming down a bit. And then that happened. And they're the 5 main murders, but there is arguments about whether they were or were not specifically Ripper murders, and same as murders occurred before and after.
Yeah, because I something told me 6 or 7. Like there's another couple that they think may be be able to be attributed to the Ripper.
Yeah, you could say about 13.
13, okay.
Yeah. And then there's a new book that's just come out by a friend of mine called Christopher Holgram, which I recommend to anyone, called Cutting Point. And that book on Jack the Ripper purports that it was Carmen, a meat lorry driver, who did the murder, who did them all, and also killed a whole bunch of other women, known as the Thames Torso murders. There was a whole bunch of women found on the edge of the Thames River with body parts cut off, usually just their torsos. And people thought that, for a long time, have thought that's just 2 separate murderers. And new books come out saying that Jack the Ripper may have killed up to 25 people, if you include another series of murders that occurred nearby.
Yeah, right. That's it. I wanted to say that it's interesting. It is interesting. I think the psyche of what it takes to be that person, and but again, if you think, it's interesting talking about it now because I was much younger when I was really into it, and it's interesting the observations that I've made while talking to you, and then also because it wasn't that diary book is the one that stands out to me. However, I read a lot of different things about the Ripper murders when I was in that period, and it's interesting to observe my different state of mind now. And different level of understanding. I mean, you look at like childhood trauma, you would think that that amount of childhood trauma, it's not a reason to do those things. However, there's got to be an interesting question, and sort of steering away from Francis Thompson for a second. What are the things that you learned from a mentality perspective, a trauma perspective, like thinking about absorbing that information for so long? And I imagine you studied it in depth. What are the things you took away from that personally, in understanding psyche or understanding that dimension of person?
Well, I guess it changed what I found to be interesting, not interesting. I think I was in love with mirrors, not doorways at one point. I think I thought serial killers were interesting. Really, they're very dull. They've got their hollow men in the centre, and so they have to do a lot of be very dramatic to get any attention or build a persona. And really, their persona is the public's perception of them.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that they all in a sense do it for the notoriety, and some just give themselves up before they finish murdering whatever amount. Just they usually revel in the fame of discovery.
Just bring that mic across, mate. Now,
sorry.
Up again, yeah.
They revel in discovery and being famous because there's nothing much to them. They're quite dull people. Yeah. They know it. But they're very smart too, So
it's interesting, man.
At one point I was interested in serial killers. I thought not that they knew anything that I didn't know, but I thought they were part of some interesting, weird world we're in. But now I see more as just black holes, just sucking up.
Well, it is.
Stuff.
That is a hollow existence to not see the beauty of life and see it as meat, or I don't know how to actually interpret that. It's interesting. Yeah. Wow. So in and around that, because there was. It wasn't, serial killers back then, they gained a bit of notoriety after that too, didn't they? Like every time there was a bunch of murders, there was different names for different things. And do you think it's a bit of if it bleeds, it leads? Is that where that sort of come from, that sort of mentality with the press and stuff like that? Or
Yeah, they definitely, the press definitely made a fortune out of it and turned the situation to their advantage as fast as they could when it came to making money and knowing what the public wanted. The press that really grew out of that was pictorial press. Mostly people read the Times and just read the words. But because the audience was a lot of EastEnders, they translated the news in images.
So they had to take photos.
Well, they didn't take photos at the time, but the Mary Kelly photo crime scenes are the first forensic crime scenes ever in history, and because but images, like when I say picture, I mean drawings, engravings, pictorial, sort of like cartoons of the news.
There's a I know what's that called. There's a type of drawing that they used to be able to print. It was like the dot drawings,
Lithographs.
Lithograph. There, that's the one. It was that. Is that how it was done in those days? Yeah.
And so the media loved it, but the media changed and became, when it became more like the Herald Sun, like the pop sort of popular newspapers, they go for the images of page 3 girl type thing, that sort of stuff started to come into. There was a change in the press's consciousness,
and you attribute majority of that to the that was the beginning.
I wouldn't say it was the beginning, because the press didn't have it, wasn't doing it, but there were you could get little comic books about criminals, Jack Shepherd and other criminals in history. Prior to that, you could get little chapbooks, and one of the victims actually made money selling little chapbooks, little storybooks on famous criminals, British criminals. So there was a culture wanting that before it got into the papers.
Oh, so one of the murder victims was selling those books.
With her husband,
because they weren't all prostitutes, were they? The victims.
Oh, they were all prostitutes, but they all had other professions as well. You had to be versatile to survive back then.
Yeah.
So they're all quite skilled. They, seamstresses, washerwomen, caring for kids, other activities. Yeah.
So you said, you just had a good mate say that he reckons that what he's found the Ripper to be. Is there any other? I mean, so do you think his argument's valid, or
he's got a really good reason to say why Jack the Ripper was his suspect? There's a guy called Charles Cross who historically was the first person to find the first murder victim. He found Marianne Nichols in Bucks Row. He first, and then another guy walked up, and they both saw the body. They weren't quite sure whether she was alive or dead, and they walked on, and later on went to some police officers, said what they saw. But Christopher Holmgren, who's published his book, and a few other people who published books on this other suspect, have it that he was the Ripper. And because when he gave his name, he gave a false name, and that showed he must be a criminal. So they said that, if you look at anyone who's going to get arrested for the murder of Marianne Nichols, you'd arrest the guy who was found near the body who gave a false name.
Yeah.
But that doesn't explain the second murder, third murder, fourth murder, fifth murder. So I think he's a great suspect. I think it's the best suspect apart from mine, because at least he was found near the body.
Yeah, he's near it.
Yeah, but everyone's got to find a body too.
Yeah.
So in that case, everyone who found the other victims weren't they suspects. But anyway, this guy's a suspect. Did give a false name. But why kill the other five? How and why kill the other four in the future from that time? Yeah. There's no explanation. There's nothing to connecting to them.
Yeah, right. So what you said that around each of the things Francis Thompson kept popping up as well. You said that the diary, he was connected to the guy with the diary.
Okay, Francis Thompson's influence.
Yeah.
Okay. The most important decision ever made in US legal history was by the Supreme Court, and it was the Brown versus Brown decision. It was the one that stopped segregation in the US, in the southern states. And when the Supreme Court made that decision, what happened was the southern states got back to him and said, oh, yeah, you want us to have blacks in schools and everything. Okay, give us some time. And they gave him 10 years. And because they thought, because they argued, it takes 10 years, you can't just put black people in school, you've got to change the bus routes.
Yeah.
If you're going to change the bus routes, you've got to change the roads, because all they live there, and now we're going to get to them. Okay, and so the big infrastructure change gave us 10 years. So the Supreme Court let them get 10 years, and 10 years later, they did nothing. And there was more lynching and murders, and the blacks stopped trusting the Supreme Court. And then they announced the reason they went wrong is It took them 10 years before they had that second Supreme Court hearing where they said, do it now. Like they gave him 3 weeks instead of. The reason they took 10 years was because in the wording, the US Supreme Court, they quoted Francis Thompson and they wrote in all immediate speed, which means do it fast. But they didn't give a time limit. And they were trying to be soft, but they didn't want to get in trouble. So they didn't quote themselves. They quoted Thompson because they thought when he wrote that, he quoted the checker, the court of 5, like the royal sided long-term legal profession. They thought they were quoting a legal term, but Thompson made it up for one of his poems. And so if Thompson is found to be a murderer, then that means that the US Supreme Court decision that reverse segregation could possibly be faulty and would stop.
Right.
And suddenly if segregation wasn't illegal, imagine what it would do today.
Mm.
And a guy called Chen wrote an essay on Francis Thompson when he and he said that it's, we should look at this guy more. This guy Cheng was like a genius student in England, US. Now he does he's like the top 10 lawyers in the United States. He's theological lawyers, writes several books, professor, major dude now. But he wrote as a student about Thompson, and he wrote, we should check this guy out because he's actually, for some bizarre reason, they quoted this guy, and what he wrote about it was weird. He was homeless and he was with a prostitute. Did they even know what they did when they quoted this poet? Did they even know his life? Because it wasn't well known. His true biographies didn't come out till well after his death. All the dark side wasn't known. It was just a nice guy who was found from the street. So not the drug taking. This guy explored that in his essay and said that's really important. Anyway, I contacted him and he's very interested. He's planning to write a new book. But the thing is, if that book comes out and is successful, it's pushing the idea. Because when the Supreme Court made that decision to desegregate, and for a time span they used all immediate haste, they quoted Thompson. Every other court in the land did the same.
Because that's a major decision. Those wording.
Possibly half the major laws in the United States were written by Jack the Ripper.
Jesus. Yeah, right.
And I'm not even beginning to tell you the ramifications in the now.
So I mean, why was he so? So you explained to me a guy who basically travelled the monasteries until his death and wrote all this poetry. He's in every poetry book, yet he doesn't have his own poetry book. I mean, it sort of feels like, and to get even more, it feels like that the church has a heavy influence on this. Because, I mean, obviously they influence laws. I mean, this is the thing that people don't understand. The church was the power in the land. So, they're the ones that actually started the whole law business. Like that's you got to pay the church and pay the taxes. Like the two are intertwined. It feels like his notoriety is tied up in there somewhere, and they knew from the beginning. I mean, how does the Nightmare Witch poem still exist today? I mean, why?
Because it's under in a bluestone fortress. It's in a huge Gothic tower in Boston.
But why would you? I don't understand why you would keep that. Like, and how if that was part of his work and that was known to be part of his work, then why was he allowed to become so prolific?
Because it wasn't known as part of his work until well after his fame faded after World War II. Yeah,
right. So basically they were kept, it was transferred over. How did it get to Boston? How did all this stuff get to Boston?
A priest was teaching Boston College, and Boston College is a big college that presidents went to. And when a priest was studying there called Father Connolly, he was frustrated by the lack of modern Catholic poetry. So he'd heard of Francis Thompson, so went to research his life. And he went to England and retraced Thompson's steps and met the people Thompson knew, and they bequeathed him the Thompson's writings. And he said he created a museum there, and it's called the Francis Thompson Room. And it's got stained glass, and it's got high ceilings, and it's got books with grills over them, and big desks.
And you've been there, have you?
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I had to go in there and say, hi, I'm here. You know that famous poet that you've got half your building for? I'm going to show that he ripped apart 5 women. Sorry. You can imagine it was difficult for me to do. I wrote to. Oh, do you want to hear my dealings with the Catholic Church?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Picture this: 1997, La Trobe University. I worked out this guy called Jack the Ripper. I end up in communication with the Archbishop of Melbourne about it. And what do you think the Archbishop of Melbourne might say if you present to him this guy and say, look, I think he could be, people might not have been aware that he could have killed a whole bunch of people, yet he's renowned and people taught him at school?
Probably brush it under the carpet, I would say.
No, if you're a Catholic bishop.
If I was a Catholic,
Archbishop, the head of Melbourne.
It's a long road for me to be a Catholic bishop. However,
what would you expect him to do if you're 27 years old and you walk up to him, you're a student? What would you hope would happen?
Well, you'd hope that he'd listen to you. However, being the Archbishop of a Catholic church, he probably dismissed you out of hand, I'd imagine.
Well, he told me that Francis Thompson wouldn't ruffle too many feathers. And that's all. He didn't offer to help in any other way. Yeah. But I think he was busy. I think he was really busy at 97.
Yeah, he was moving pedophiles around Victoria in 1997.
Yeah, Cardinal Pell.
Yeah. Oh, was that Pell? Yeah, right. He's a fucking evil dude.
Yeah, strange guy. Strangely, didn't seem like it was weird. Oh, by the way, Francis Thompson was a pedophile. This is shown from his writings and his activities after the murders, and also before, actually. So, strangely enough, going into Archbishop Pell in 1997, saying, I think I've worked out one of the Holy Grail of crime writing, and it's a famous Catholic poet who was a pedophile. Strangely, Archbishop Cardinal Pell wasn't as eager as I thought he would be to explore that in the press with me. I wonder why.
Well, he was a busy man back then.
Yeah, must have been really busy.
Yeah, he was busy shifting.
But he was told, because a retainer of the Catholic Church who I knew well informed him, and we shared information. But yeah, didn't want to investigate it. Strange.
Yeah, well, Cardinal Pell in 1997. Yeah, anyway.
And then I wrote to his publishers who were made a fortune from his works, and I wrote to them, hi, this person who your entire family's wealth lies upon, the same family who own Tintin.
Okay, the Adventures of Tintin. Yeah, righto.
Same money. They I let them know that, hey, no hard feelings, but I think your guy ripped apart 5 women. And they wrote back that they see no ill intent. Thank you very much for giving them a copy of the book. And if they don't mind, can they put in their library and use it for their biographies in the possible future? They're very nice. Even they today publish for the Catholic Church. They're the ones who paint Lives of the Saints and Catholic calendars. They're the ones, like the liturgicals, the big books on what to do and what dates. That's their role today. They're big.
Right. So they've got a copy of your book for their...
Not this version, but an old copy.
Yeah.
Very old.
So what else did the Catholic Church have to say? You just said that you had communication.
I've been told I'm going to burn in hell by a right-wing conservative Catholic newspaper online that some people wrote again about because I'd committed a crime. It's one of the deadly sins where I forget the name, but a crime where you speak badly about a dead person.
Right.
Yeah, it's a long word, some sort of infidel thing, bad thing. And yeah, they were very verbose about how could I, just because he wrote a story about killing a woman doesn't mean that he's Jack the Ripper, and how dare I say that without any evidence.
Well, I think over the last little while you've presented quite a interesting array of evidence for yeah, wow. So where do you want to go, mate? Where do you want to go from here? I mean, that it's observing and thinking about it on the fly during this conversation has been a very fascinating experience. And
I haven't touched into it, so I haven't skimmed the surface.
Yeah, right. So where do you want to go? What do you want to tell us? Where do you want to take it? Where do you want to go from here? Story.
Okay. What's the motive?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he did it as a pagan sacrifice to resurrect someone.
Why? Where would you go with that? I mean, being a student of the church for over 8 years.
Because when he was homeless, what he did was he got interested in the cult, like heavily interested in the occult, like William D. and the 16th century, 17th century occultists and necromancers back then, read their works, like devoured them.
Mm-hmm.
Also modern occultists, the Crowley sort of
Yeah, I was
spectrum.
going to say that's Crowley's gang, is it? The Golden Dawn and all that sort of stuff.
That sort of stuff. But he was Crowley was only 13 at the time. But Crowley got famous because of Francis Thompson. It was Francis Thompson who, he was a poet, but he was very influential in ways, and he's the one who talked up Aleister Crowley's poetry and got Crowley up into the limelight.
Really?
Yeah.
So he brought, right.
Yeah. Oh, just a quick thing. Martin Luther King quoted Francis Thompson. Martin Luther King Jr. was inspired by Thompson's poetry and included in his speeches he gave just before he shot. What else? I know Francis Thompson's poetry were in the book depository.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he was very big then in the 60s in the US. I know that Gandhi recommended Francis Thompson as the companion to have always. When Gandhi was under house arrest, he kept Francis Thompson's poetry by his side and read it for inspiration.
So, okay. So
have you heard of Lord of the Rings?
Yeah.
Yeah, some of the elven towns in Lord of the Rings are named after words created by Francis Thompson, like Lothlorien comes from his poetry, and J.R.R. Tolkien was a great fan and gave speeches and lectures about Francis Thompson and his influence in his poetry and in the concept of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, right. Because a part of I know because Tolkien was in one of the wars, and that said there's some of the stuff come from the things he saw in war, and he was trying to make sense of it. That's how he escaped.
But the words, some of the Elven language and other language words come from Thompson.
Wow, it's interesting.
T.S. Eliot, G.K. Chesterton, they're all Ezra Pound. All of them were influenced by him. Loved his stuff, emulated his stuff. W.B. Yeats. So the Second Coming. You've heard of the Second Coming by W. Yeats?
Yeah,
it's a short.
That rings a bell.
Turn the winding gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. What rough beaks thou just to in Bethlehem waiting to be born. That's often quoted in films. That was Francis Thompson's poem, but short. Sister Songs is a long version, and Yeats basically just squeezed it down into one verse, but the same concepts all the way through, the same narrative. And W.B. Yeats knew Thompson in 1888.
Yeah, right.
Well, met him at the editor's house.
So is these editors, as you say, is that the same family today that still publishes for?
Well, no, Burns and Oates aren't the Meanall family. What happened is with the Meanall family, after Thompson died and they got all his money, they decided to do two things. One, make Francis Thompson a saint, and that's why they made relics, face masks and hand masks and stuff, and started to set it up so that he become Saint Thompson. And the other project they had was to make a new Francis Thompson, and that's where they got D.H. Lawrence. And D.H. Lawrence was housed in their country estate, made from the money of Francis Thompson's poetry, and they tried to create a Francis Thompson minus the prostitute and the murders.
So how does he make so much money from poetry back in those? Is it just being published and read and books being bought and stuff like that?
Yeah, it was just after his death, it went massive. He was massively famous. The Hound of Heaven is his most famous poem. Richard Burton does a good narration of it. You can hear on YouTube. Andrew Lloyd Webber uses his poetry for his songs, and did a whole. Some people have done symphonies with his poetry.
Wow. So it really is an intense cultural
phenomena.
And you think that.
You know that poem, that song by Simon Garfunkel, where I think it's called Morning 3 a.m. It says, on the wall, quick he slashes upon the station, then he dashes quick into the evening. There's this, I forget the exact words, but they wrote that poem in Whitechapel. And Jack the Ripper wrote writing on the wall, which was one of the, they haven't gone into the murders, but yeah, there's interesting things.
So where do you want to go? Do you want to go into the murders? Do you think where?
Oh yeah, the motive. Yeah, so I think there were 5.
You got to bring that mic up to your face.
There were 5 murders, mechanical murders, and there were 5 wounds on Christ. And I believe he was trying to create another crucifixion, and a female crucifixion to bring back the prostitute. I think he killed her in a panic and didn't mean to kill her, but did. And a body was found in the foundations of New Scotland Yard that they were building at the time, and there was a torso of a woman, and I believe that was his woman. I think he found her and killed her, and then wanted to bring her back, but bring her back so she can't get away. And I think the idea was to make her, from his poetry, and I've got quotes from his works and his essays to back this up. He believed, I think, he was going to create like a super spirit, like an entity that enveloped the earth. So when he would drink from water, it tastes like her kisses, or he'd touch a table, it'd feel like her skin. And if he jumped in a puddle, it'd be her laughter. And he wanted to actually physically create that. And by killing these 5 women in particular dates and particular places and particular positions, and I can tell you why. I can go through the murders and say how they drive to that conclusion. And I believe he thinks he did bring her back, but not what he expected.
Right. And do you think the reason he spent the rest of his life in solitude, because he had her, or what do you mean? Like it's a...
Well, what came back was an amalgam of the victims and her to him.
Right.
So when he stepped in a puddle that splashed red blood into his eyes, tea would taste like blood. She came back, but the screams of the victims and all that, the muffled cries and the slashing sounds, I think that became the whole universe to him. And and he would have argued that it is, we just can't see in his spectrum.
Yeah, right.
And there were strange parallels between later disasters and other horrific events that match Francis Thompson's life. Maybe I can go in there for a moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
The Titanic.
Yeah.
People have written about Thompson. The closest people to him have suggested he had something to do with that, even though it happened 19 years after his death, I think. Because what happened was just before it went off, a priest at the wharf read Francis Thompson's poem that has the lines, "Down Titanic looms, it sank," and basically said Francis Thompson's predicting this will sink. And a man on the Titanic, or W.T. Stead, argued with him, who was a journalist who went on the Titanic, and he was last seen, I don't know what book, but reading a book in the library just before it went underwater. And people argued that he prophesied or made that happen, but I don't know. That's
and do you think that it's because of the occult? I mean, if he's tied into Crowley and the Golden Dawn, and or he had an influence over those people, that was some really strange, energetic, spirituality type stuff. I mean, there's some very interesting things that came out of that when you study that. I mean, so some of his work was, those guys read his work as well, obviously.
Yeah, those guys read his work and said they really loved it.
Right.
Here's a coincidence. The very first book on Jack the Ripper ever was called The Lodger, and it was made into a film by Alfred Hitchcock later, and I think a few other remakes. It's still a best-selling book. And The Lodger was published by a publishing firm that was 2 doors down from Francis Thompson's editor's publishing firm. And Francis Thompson's editor often worked for Mehuon Publishing, the other publishing company. So there was Meanles Publishing, Mehuon, who did The Lodger. And The Lodger was written by Marie Bullock Lowndes, and her brother, Hilaire Bullock, was longtime best friends with the editor, and they lived next door to each other in the country estate, eventually that Francis Thompson's money bought. And the money that was made from The Lodger was the first time big money was made after the murders on the murders, and Meanles' family were involved with that company. So Meanles made money from the poetry, but also made money from a book about Jack the Ripper, the first best-selling book on Jack the Ripper.
And what does The Lodger say? Or is it just a study on the murders?
The Lodgers was about a woman who has a mysterious man become a lodger at her house, and as the murders take place, she increasingly suspects that he's the murderer. But it turns out he's not. He's just a man who's been wandering the East End looking for his woman who's left him. And the real murder turns out to be a man who resembles Francis Thompson and speaks with a poetic tilt to his voice.
So isn't that book describing in 2 different ways?
Yeah.
Francis Thompson?
Yeah. They never lied. They didn't keep anything secret. They wrote everything. Obviously, we just didn't want to. They don't want to see it. So can't blame them.
So
they just make money off it.
Yeah, right. Do you think maybe they got the idea from that book because I mean, if you try and put that together, they were friends, all that sort of stuff. He probably knew Francis Thompson because isn't that the same editor that took him?
Yeah, the editor took him in and made money from his poetry. And the editor was fascinated in the Ripper murders during the time of the Ripper murders. He was so interested, he even went to the Archbishop and they discussed Ripper murders together, expressly about the murders. He had theories about the murder and collected newspaper clippings of it. He knew the murders very well at the same time. Not more than most Londoners. Like, you don't normally hold a meeting with the most powerful religious person in the land, in your church, about the murders, unless you have some interest or knowledge of the murders more than the common person.
And was The Lodger a non-fiction book, or was it written?
Just a story. And what stories? Stories don't make you a criminal. Why am I picking on Thompson?
Yeah.
It's just a story.
It's just a story that lines up exactly.
Exactly. Yeah.
So how do we know that he was looking for his prostitute girlfriend?
Because he told us. He wrote it down.
Yeah, right. That was his plan.
Yeah. Well, he didn't. He also wrote down, I believe, his plan in his short story, in his poetry,
yeah,
in
obviously,
his essays.
yeah.
That he had a greater plan, which was to create the birth of an antichrist, that sort of thing, a birth of an entity that would corrupt the world but serve him.
And you think that he believes he achieved it, but it was
he called himself a prophet. And there were a few prophecies he gave, which I talk about in my book, that came true. And he always said that anything I prophesied will happen at least 50 years in the future. He said he was a magician and a Pharisee, which is the high priest. And he was fascinated in the occult all the way through the rest of his life.
So what's some of the prophecies that came true? Don't give them all away when people get to buy your book, however.
Well, he prophesied the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in 1957 or something. That's one of it.
And how did he prophesise that one?
He wrote in his poem. A lot of his poems are either regurgitations of the murders or prophecies of what the world will turn into because of him.
And has all right. I am very curious. This is a dark hole. However, how did he think he was building an antichrist? Because I mean, am I correct in saying, and this is my memory, in a few of the ones the breasts were cut off and stuff like that?
If you get all the pieces that were cut out of all the different victims separately, you could build a woman.
Right.
The first murder occurred in Bucks Road, but Bucks Road used to be called Ducking Pond Lane. Where the murder victim was found was actually once a pond where they used to punish witches and torture them to death, or prostitutes, wicked women. Thompson's Nightmare of the Witch Babies discusses that concept, witches and killing them because they're evil and corrupt. It's about a man who's wandering the street, sees a fair lady and follows her to woo her, and then realises she's a prostitute, and then he's so appalled that he gleefully cuts her apart. So the first murder occurred where he killed witches. The second murder, which was Annie Chapman, he's the woman the stepmother who he called a witch, who drank his blood in his poetry about her. Her surname was Richardson. The victim's name was Anne, the one found in the back of Hanbury Street. On 29 Hanbury Street, it had the name A. Richardson or Anne Richardson. The owner's name, Anne Richardson, matched the name of the victim and Francis Thompson's evil stepmother, and she was killed there. The third murder occurred which occurred in Burn Street, was a socialist meeting taking place by the Jewish communists or socialists,
right.
And the night's talk was about atheism. The third murder, Mitre Square, happened near the Jewish synagogue, the largest Jewish synagogue, Jewish church in all of England, and occurred in the backyard practically of that. The murder of Mary Kelly occurred in the steeple shadow of the Protestant church. It was 100 metres away from the Protestant church, 100 feet. So at the time of the murders, the shadow, even though it was at night from the moon, the shadow of the church was going across her building when she was killed horrifically in her room. The murders occurred on saint days, or in every day was a saint day, and a saint day means patron saint protected occupation of that on that day, like a soldier or wheelwright or whatever. But the murders in each of the 5 murders, or 4 days because it was a double murder, happened on the patron saints of either butchers, soldiers, or doctors. And the chances of that happening is 1 in 320,000, that you'd have all the murders, because what I mean is the police were looking for butchers or soldiers or doctors because they're the only professions where you're required to carry knives.
Yeah.
And coincidentally, all the murders occurred on the Catholic saint days of butchers, soldiers, and doctors. So Thompson, and all the murders occurred in a sanctuary before Henry VIII came around and kicked all the Catholics out and got rid of the Catholic Church when merry old England was Catholic. That area was a Catholic sanctuary, and the whole point of a sanctuary is if you committed a crime, you'd seek refuge in a sanctuary, and you couldn't be taken out by the sheriff, because if you were a criminal, God would have killed you because you're on holy ground.
You're on holy ground, yeah.
And Francis Thompson killed on holy grounds to him, under the protection of a saint, of someone who had to use a knife. Sometimes the midwife had to kill the mother to rescue the baby, or kill the baby to rescue the mother. All those occupations had to kill with a knife. So you'd be unclean, so they protected you so you could still hold mass and be pure to come back to the sanctuary.
Right.
So he killed in the sanctuary. So the fact that when he killed and he wasn't, God didn't kill him, since he's killing on a Catholic saint day in the sanctuary. And he's also defined different institutions against the Catholic Church, the atheists, the Protestants, the Jews. So there's a lot of, but people say, did he choose the victim? No, he just chose whoever happened to walk past at that near that spot.
Just chose the location.
Yeah. And if you get the locations and you draw them down, you just assume the locations are points on a cross, the compass points. He went from the first murder, he went east, then he went southwest, then he went east again, and then he went northwest, which makes the infinity symbol. And the infinity symbol is is the old symbol of the Vesica Pisces on its side. The Vesica Pisces was traditionally the symbol of the church for a long time, for most of its history. And he studied Catholic history, of course. He studied the old maps of the East End. He went the maps from Edward Stowe from the 17th century at the Guildhall Library. He knew the old street plans of the old underground tunnels where the priests used to go through. He knew the subway systems and the underground water systems, and he knew the old maps and layouts.
And how did he know that?
Because he used to study them at the Guildhall Library. The only maps and the best maps of old England were stored in this library, and he used to go there being homeless because in winter it could keep you warm. The public was allowed to be accessed. It had been open for the first time that year, I think 87, to be open, 1887, to the public. But the public who were homeless would use it to sleep in to keep warm.
Right.
And that's when he would spend the winters there, but reading the old maps and plans and ecclesiastical history of Whitechapel. And so, there was this replication and inversion of the crucifixion. And also the women were placed in birthing positions. Like Martha Taberham, she was placed on her back with her legs spread as if she'd just been having sex. That's how the police described it. They said had just indulged in carnality, however they phrased it back then. The other victims were always sprayed out, split out. Victims, the injuries were to the wombs and uterus.
Yeah, I know, yeah. But if you, as you say,
that's a satanic sort of inversion, because you convert the cross, but the Vesica Pisces, you invert it into an infinity symbol. And and funny enough, he lived in Charing Cross, which means turning cross. And funny enough, he wrote about the swastika and its power, and he wrote later on someone should use it.
Really?
Yeah. When Hitler bombed, the most intense, excessive bombing happened on the murder sites, which was the quarter square mile of London, the docks, and they said it was to knock out the docks. But it seemed to be much more north than the people say he should have been bombing. Hitler seemed to really want to flatten the East End.
Yeah, right.
Most intense bombing in all of England, where the murders happened.
Yeah, right. I mean, the bomb sites weren't real good back then, but if they're doing it consistently.
Consistently.
And why would you say that? Well, I mean, what's the correlation there? I feel like
Oh, I don't know.
You don't know? Just another fact.
Well,
along the way.
I don't mention that in my book, you see. So I shouldn't speak on things I don't mention the Hitler stuff, because that doesn't prove he's Jack the Ripper, and all my book tries to do is show he's Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
Anything interesting I don't have in my book.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it's about circular, so it's dull. I only have what shows that he's the Ripper in there. Things that are interesting like that. You know, there's one thing I have in my book which I think is interesting, is that if you look at, okay, so England's had serial killers after Jack the Ripper. Jack the Ripper was the first.
Yeah.
And if you look at, so you can list them in different ways, like importance, fame, whatever. But if you list them in how prolific they are, as in number of victims, how much they actually killed, which is what it's all about, if you don't want it to happen or want it to happen, the places and that these murders took place match exactly the only places Francis Thompson ever lived in England. To give you an example, and I can't do an order because I don't remember the order of the five.
It's okay.
Dennis Nilsson was a killer in London who used to behead homeless men found on the banks of the River Thames. There's a particular walled area that I've seen when I was in London, and the embankments they call it. And he'd pick up homeless men from the embankments and he'd eat them, screw them when they're dead, cut them up. And he was one of the top 5 prolifics. Thompson, when he was homeless, was living on the embankments of the Thames. The second top guy was most prolific was the acid bloodbath murderer, and Walter Haig. And what he did was he dissolved his victims in acid baths, and he was found in Crawley, Sussex. Thompson lived in Crawley, Sussex, and remember he didn't get around much. He lived in Crawley, Sussex, and he was and Walter Haig, the bloodbath acid murderer, one of the top 5 prolific killers. He was arrested in the Kensington Hotel, and Thompson lived across the road from the Kensington Hotel when he was in London, when he was living with the editors, and having rooms near the editor's place being watched.
Were any of these top 5, were they during Thompson's life? Or?
No, all these serial killers happened after he died. You've probably heard of the Moors murder. There was that man and woman, Ian Brady, and I forget the lady's name, thank goodness, an awful woman. They're both awful. Their victims were children kidnapped from Ashton-upon-Lyne in Manchester, where Thompson grew up. One of the victims was kidnapped from Ashton Marketplace, and Thompson, when he first, the most horrific experience he had before the riots was when he got lost from his mother in Ashton Marketplace, and he wrote that was the most terrifying moment in his life, to realise that you could lose your mother could lose you. Other serial killers, Shepherd. Dr. Shepherd, he was a guy who killed a bunch of old people, about 300 or so, in using morphine overdose. He arrested himself. He went to the police station and said, I've killed all these women. I'm the biggest model murderer ever, which he is. And he was arrested himself in Ashton-upon-Lyne police station, where Francis Thompson, Ashton-upon-Lyne, where the riots took place. And and Shipman, who was a Catholic, he killed his victims using the same drug Thompson was addicted to. Funny thing about Crawley, the bloodbath murderer, when they asked why did he kill the women, he said, I had this dream after a car accident, I injured my head, and I had this nightmare that recurred where I was beneath a tree that dripped blood, and this man would come with a chalice and fill up the blood and urge me to drink it. And one night I drank it and I started killing. I don't know why I did it. Thompson's poem has a man who collects the blood from a dripping tree and feeds it to people. In one of his other poems about the Tyburn tree, the hanging tree in London where they used to kill the Catholics. I could all this. Have I missed one of the top 5? Oh yeah, the most female was Anne. I forget her surname. Lived in Durham. She killed boys and men in 1878. The youngest victim was age 11, which was the age Thompson was when he went to Durham to study at Usher College. So the top 5s in the country, not only I could go into their murders, but not only their murders, but the actual place of murder match him, like 5 points on a map. And I've only done the top 5. So, and I haven't talked about Son of Sam, who said, he wrote in his will, I believe, I kill for the Witch King, Thompson's Nightmare of the Witch Babies. And I haven't talked about all the US serial killers and the poems that they quoted before they were shot on the firing range. I haven't gone into the Beatles. I haven't talked about how he's connected to what's his name, the guy who's William Burroughs. I haven't.
So, okay, I want to go esoteric. I mean, all that stuff, I want to hear all that stuff, but I'm either picking up something else or I'm picking up what you're putting down. I'm either picking up something else or picking up what you're putting down. Do you think that he actually created an entity that is echoed through time? Do you think that the other one, mate? Yeah. Do you think that he's created an echo through time? Is there something to this? Has he created an energetic entity that is affecting?
I didn't want to spoil my book because I haven't tried to spoil the plot.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, man.
But there is. It's at the end of my book, but I can tell you I don't mind.
Yeah.
But there is a twist in the tale.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just... Like, it's just very creepy. I mean, and I suppose for myself, I know where the... You know, I've studied the Golden Dawn. I studied Crowley and how that all ended up and the darkness that all went into. I mean, he is...
I should get to the creepy bit. I haven't even said the creepy bit yet.
What's the creepy bit?
Well, creepy bit is
we've just had a lot of creepy stuff, man.
The creepy bit is after he died, 2 years before he died, he came up with a new idea, which was, oh no, I can bring her back, and that's really bad because she's this horror demon thing that's haunting me forever now. But my real love is there somewhere, but she's in heaven, but I can't go to heaven because I killed a bunch of people. So how do I get to see her? And he decided, and I've got it in there. He decided to wait for it till the end of time, for the apocalypse, when the end of time, when all the dead rise and they're all together to be judged.
Right,
at least I can see her again. So the only way he could get there is to not die. So I believe he spent the last 2 years of his life putting himself into his writing, like actually transferring his psyche into his poetry.
And look, and
he wrote about this. He wrote about the investment of magic into words and in putting yourself in many ways in his poems, bedding your spirit into the text. And he would argue, and he sort of says it, and he says it cheekily, and I've quoted him in a lot of his poems, little sort of twists and jokes for his poetry. It basically says, we think we're interested in Jack the Ripper, we think we want to know about history, but it's just Francis Thompson hiding in us, wanting to hear about himself.
Wow. So I mean, look, and this shows my wife loves Harry Potter, but like a Horcrux, you know what I mean? How he embeds parts of his soul into certain magical objects. Do you think that this is what Francis Thompson spent the last 2 years of his life doing? Actually putting the essence of him in whatever form that is into his writing.
Yeah.
And then that therefore has influenced many different things.
Yeah. That he is immortal and he lives forever now. And not only, see, the crimes would have maybe done it, but it wouldn't have been all him. But Thompson's release, even though his books, it's hard to get his books. Apart from
why is it hard to get his books? If he was so
because he's considered now an extreme, almost terrorist-like poet. When he did write Essays Published, he basically said, throw children off bridges in London, better they be killed than grow up to be poor and stuff. He had a very hard line. He really liked the Salvation Army, but wanted to have a Catholic army with real swords. He thought it would be good. He had some really hardcore Catholic ideas, which, and during World War II, was like, yeah, fight the enemy, get the Germans. There was that militant Catholic sort of, like he named himself after a Catholic crusader called Tancred in his writing. And Tancred was a crusader who basically butchered a whole bunch of Muslims and took over Jerusalem for a while. He was into that military stuff. He was an armchair general.
When did he die?
When did he die? 1907. To give you an example, a funny story. Do you want to hear a funny story?
Yeah, well, let's have a funny story. Like this is. I'm seeing a dark entity that has cast a shadow long and wide, and I can see how this rabbit hole consumed you, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah. I didn't get bored. It was very interesting 20 years.
Yeah.
Made TV even more interesting to watch. So
because he literally, he is the reason if it bleeds, it leads. And if he is attached, his entity and his writing to that is then manipulating modern media to this day.
You're a ripper. You bloody ripper. It's come on. And let me be frank with you, Francis Thompson. Doubting Thomas. There's stuff like even quotes. Famous movie titles come from his poetry, like from the 50s and stuff. I just can't think of any at the moment, but they're in my book. No, are they? Yeah, I have to think of one. Lines from his poetry just became movie titles we love today. Yeah.
So let me be frank with you. Is that actually referencing him? Is that?
Well, yeah.
Do we know that, or is that
that's the thing. When you go down the rabbit hole, okay, so Wilfred Meadle might have known, his wife may have known, then you have to go, who else might have known? Who else might have known? But I think all that detracts from the man, because I think it's diabolical. And diabolical means evil with intent and a lot of scheming. Oh, yes. Oh, so here's something. So the guy in charge of police investigation was a guy called Sir Charles Warren, and he after the last murder, he quit the police force. The Queen called him up and said, "What the hell are you going to do?" Funny enough, the Queen from the first murder said in the first murder to the head of the police, "You told me this wouldn't happen."
Right.
And anyway, after the murders, he quit the police force. She called him up and said, "What are you going to do? He's just killed a woman brutally in the home. Now he just goes in people's houses. What are we going to do?" And he said, "Not me, I've quit." And then later on, 10 years later, he was in the Boer War. And if you go to, I don't know if you got the Guinness Book of World Records, but if you go to the worst military episode ever, it's Sir Charles Warren. He got, the murders happened in Quarter Square Mile, okay, with one guy with a knife who terrorised all of London, all of England, changed the perspective of crime around the world. What he did was, Thompson was born in Lancashire. Warren got 2,000 Lancashire men in a battle. And what he did is, just before the battle took place, and it was called the Battle of Spear and Cop, a hill that they wanted to take from the Germans. And what he did was, he had like 8,000 men. And remember, so he's the guy trying to capture the Ripper and got all the press flack and got forced out. 10 years later, he's in the Boer War. In this battle, interesting battle, he got his soldiers, he had something like 8,000 soldiers, gets two of them and says to 8,000, 6,000, he says, "Go away, I just want 2,000. He gets the 2,000 of the best, and he gets them to march forward. He goes, "Okay, drop all your guns." He tells them to unload all their ammunition and get rid of all their weapons. And he says, "I only want you to take the hill with knives." And he has them go up this hill at a Quarter Square Mile, Lancashire men with a knife each, fighting for their lives while they machine gun behind the Germans. And so many men died holding the mountaintop, this little flat square area, because they tried to dig with their knives little trenches, which are about like a few centimetres deep, and got bitten by ants and just died, got shot to pieces. And funny enough, Warren, who failed to capture Jack the Ripper on that day, captured Winston Churchill, because Winston Churchill was a journalist at the time. Churchill's knew Wilfred Meadle. Okay, Wilfred Meadle's father, and Alice Meadle had those relationships between them, sort of amorous relationships between the Churchills and the Meadles.
Right.
Winston Churchill got arrested for trying to override the orders of Warren. He basically tried to get them into retreat and bring him back, and he got arrested. And another person almost got arrested that day was Mahatma Gandhi. He was also at the same battle, working on the stretchers of the Red Cross. And then after the British got the hill, Charles Warren then said, "We don't want it anymore," and abandoned it because his experiment was done.
Why would he tell him to put there? I mean,
So you got one man. Okay, one man terrorizes an entire city with one knife. Imagine if you had 2,000 men like that who are desperate for their lives in the Quarter Square Mile if you command them right, if you know about the Ripper crimes. What can I do? So I failed catching the Ripper, but what if I can make 2,000 of them? Clones of the Ripper.
Yeah, right.
Eugenics. Funny enough, Francis Thompson died. Oh, his death's funny. He died age 47, pretty young. What happened was that the editor said, "You don't look too well. I think you get sick." And Thompson said, "No, I'm fine." He goes, "No, I think you got a bad cough." And Thompson said, No, I'm all right. I'm fine. Thanks. And he goes, "No, I think you should go to hospital." Thompson goes, "No, I don't want to go to hospital. I'm fine." Then he gets a letter from the editor's daughter saying, "I'm dying. I'm in hospital. Can you please come? The priest is giving last rites." So Thompson flees to the runs to the hospital, gets grabbed by security, gets searched for drugs, which they find in his shoe. They chuck him in an isolation ward on the top floor in the corner, keep him there with off drugs, going through withdrawals by himself for a week, and then the editor rocks up with his son-in-law, who's a lawyer, and saying, if you sign this will and give me all your rights to your writing, we'll give you drugs. And he did. He signed all that stuff, and then 2 days later died. Overdose. And the funny enough, the guy who was a lawyer was a man called Caleb Saleeby, who was the head of the English Eugenics Society. At the time was preaching the elimination of killing of criminals, like Hitler eventually did. And people say the eugenics movement of England is what spurred Hitler on, to cause the Holocaust. And Thompson died at the age of 47, which was the age of his oldest victim. And then he had a secret private burial a week later, and it wasn't even mentioned in the press until after being dead and buried. And there was an autopsy performed, it was secret.
There wasn't an autopsy performed?
Well, officially there wasn't, but there was.
So do you think that he shared that he created this entity, or, you know what I mean? Like, how deep do you think the rabbit hole goes? I mean, are we talking about another level of dark secrets from the Catholic Church, or, you know, because I mean, if you play that out, they've used those very things that technically, if he did his job, they've used that to their advantage for the last 200 years.
Yeah. What are we going to do about it?
What can you do? Wait for the apocalypse. Wow. Man, I had no idea where this was going to go.
And I've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
Chesterton said about, in G.K. Chesterton, he wrote Father Brown Mysteries. He's quite still heard of. He wrote, Francis Thompson, you can look infinitely in and infinitely out and out. He said that thing he spun over his head wasn't ethereal, it was the earth.
So hang on a minute. Did you just say before that potentially through his work he inspired eugenics?
The head of the Eugenics Society was the man who witnessed a will, and weirdly enough, Thompson died of a prescribed of morphomania, was the technical term, which is a drug overdose from morphine, 2 days after, alone in his cell in the top floor of this isolation. They took the whole floor and put him in a corner and left him there 2 days after signing the will. He died 2 days later, administering him drugs.
And they administered him, or he was administering himself?
They took it to the room, which he's locked in.
And okay. It's heavy, man. That's heavy stuff. So where did he...
Can you see why Stonehenge doesn't bother me that much?
Yeah.
Because there's more things in heaven and earth than we'll ever know, and I know nothing.
Yeah. I've got like 1,000 questions that I'm not sure I want to know the answer to. You know what I mean? Like there's things rolling through my head. How did he... So...
It's a ghost story. That's why.
So do we know... You said he studied paganism and all that sort of stuff. The texts that he would have been studying back then are probably the ones that are now locked in underneath the Vatican. But that could have potentially been proper, full-blown ritual.
You have, trust me, it's in my book. He really went into it. We're talking about like the numerology of 5.
Yeah.
General principles of the numerology. We're talking about Zoroastrian symbology. We're talking about Freemason history. He wrote a book against the Freemasonry. He even wrote a whole confession of the murders, I believe. His editor asked for it. The editor said, hey, because he'd almost killed another woman, I believe, and I can talk about why the editors might have feared, and you can tell by their actions that's what they suspected. But the editor said, look, why don't you just put it all down on paper? Write everything that happened in 1888. Just get it over with. Just get it out of your mind. Thompson did.
Yeah.
Spent a few months writing it, And then the next day, and he said to the editor, read it. The next day, the editor said, I read it. And he goes, oh, what's happening to it? Did you go to the Vatican like he said it would? He goes, no, I burnt it.
Right. But you don't think you did burn it? You never know. There's no way.
I have no idea. But I do know things were sent to the Vatican from Francis Thompson. There were other things that were sent directly to them from them that he'd created. But, Francis Thompson, Jack the Ripper. Francis Thompson only had one lung. Do you know that Pope Francis only has one lung?
Really?
Yeah, strange.
Did they make him a
Synchronicity.
saint? Did they make him a saint in the end? Was he?
No, to be a saint, you have to have 3 miracles. And there was a miracle of halfpennies, and there was a couple other miracles I could go into. But for some reason, well, basically, as I said, he was too fanatical. It read well in 1845, didn't read well in the hippie 60s.
Yeah, right. Because of all the darkness of his poems and all that sort of stuff.
Well, yeah, they started to discover things. They found out that Wilfred basically edited heaps of stuff and burned and it changed, made poems more palatable. Tried to destroy anything he could.
Right, to try and save his name or try not to make him out for the monster that he actually was.
To preserve the dignity of a great poet, he suffered looking for his loved one on the streets of London. A purely innocent man. Couldn't hurt a fly, his wife said. Couldn't hurt a fly. But funny, even though he didn't hurt a fly, apparently, he killed something like, I think, like 500 million wasps once.
500 million wasps? I mean,
just before he died, he was staying 2 years on that. 2 years before he died, I was talking about the time he was investing himself into his literature. 2 years before his death, he was staying in a farm in Sussex, and there were wasps staying at the farm, and the owner was a guy called Wilfred Blunt. And Wilfred Blunt said, "I'm sorry about all the wasps; they're particularly numerous this summer." But one finally bit Thompson, and Thompson cursed it in Latin, and then they disappeared, and they didn't come back for a year. All the wasps in Sussex vanished. And the guy, Wilfred Blunt, was an ambassador for the Crown.
So are we... and look, there's terminology that you can only use because there's no other terminology to use. Are you saying he's a high dark wizard or something along those lines? Are we? Is that where you're steering this sort of thing? Because I mean...
Well, I don't know anything about Francis Thompson. I know it's just what everyone else knows. Like, nothing comes from a hidden box. It didn't come from a secret whisper. Or something under a table. It's all in the public domain.
But it's in the public domain. How you spent 20 years digging. I'm sure you've seen documents that no one else has seen.
I have. I handled, like the Jack the Ripper letter, I was handling it. I was the only person ever, I think, in the last decades to touch it. And because I had a good reason to actually physically hold it. And when I was led there by machine gun armed guards to the bowels of the Kew archives to be alone in a room with it, and the letter that talks about ripping up women. And I was holding it thinking, I should just rip it. It'd be so funny. So I go to jail, but I'd be famous. Why? Because he reckons this guy's Jack the Ripper. I would have got famous faster. And it would have been more fun. I was younger then. But I thought, even though it's a funny joke, I have to keep, I know this is awful, but I have to keep to truth. And if I destroy evidence, that's probably not smart.
So what made you, okay, there's got to be a story in itself. How do you even apply to look at the boss letter?
I said that you needed, that what had never been taken of the Francis Thompson, the Jack the Ripper letters, is the series of letters that was including the Dear Boss letter, was forensic photographs. People had photographed it, but they hadn't done it forensically where you use a ruler and a scale, because without that, a forensic pathologist can go to 8 out of 10 in a court of law that guy's the Ripper, or the guy who wrote the letter.
You're addressing the handwriting.
Yeah. But if you have scale and angle for the photos, then what you get is a 10 out of 10. You can actually have someone say, without a doubt, that's the same handwriter. And I could have then shown whether Thompson had or had not written the Jack the Ripper letter, not if he'd killed the women. That could be a different story. But, it still pushes something more interesting.
And what was the result of that?
The result was he wasn't, Francis Thompson, from one pathologist I went to, was that it wasn't him who wrote it, which was really hard for me because I thought that'd be obvious. But I now, and whether I convinced myself or not, but to me it seems more logical, it was actually the editor, because the editor was known to do that. The editor in the past had written things in the major press to get people's attention.
Right. Okay.
So he'd done it. It was a practice in the past.
So did you compare that handwriting?
No, I haven't done that.
Yeah,
I haven't, can't afford it, and don't know why I should have to.
Yeah.
I wrote a book.
there's a 400-page book in front of us that tells us everything we need to know.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So I can't speak for Francis Thompson about. I can't say what he thought, but I can say what he wrote, because what he wrote could be a lie. I don't know what he actually thought, but from what he wrote, it seems as if he thought he was an evil, diabolical person who would change, because he killed in the most powerful city on the planet. It changed the world.
London was the seat of the world.
They're the center of the world. And if he committed some sort of weird inverted nativity.
Because didn't they, obviously it was 1888, but they reported the Jack the Ripper crimes down here in Australia too, didn't they? It went around the world.
Yeah, and we've got suspects who died in Australia. There's Patrick Deeming was hung in Old Melbourne Jail, and he apparently, as he fell, yelled out, "I am Jack the," and then...
Yeah, right.
So we've got connections. Also, a lot of the victims' ancestors live here, and I've spoken to the ancestors of the victims, the descendants of the people who were murdered by him, or the Ripper, and they've been very glad that I've done what I've done.
Yeah,
luckily.
Right. So what were their takes on it?
They cried and said, we hated the place and scared the hell out of us, and thank you for finding him.
So they agree with you?
Yeah. Well, Francis Thompson's family agrees with me.
Really?
Yeah, it's been known from the Thompson family line, that Thompson was Jack the Ripper. It was like a party story.
Right. So he went on to have children, obviously, did he?
No, he didn't have children, because the only time he had sex was with that prostitute, apparently. He never had any other relationship ever.
Oh, because he's a pious Catholic.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, right.
And, he was fucked a prostitute, it was nothing. Then with him, sorry, what was the question? I suddenly thought about what I just said.
Well, no, I was just saying that the Thompson family believes it was him, and I asked if he had any children.
Oh no, his brother had children, so they were great, sort of like his great uncle to the people who I know now, who are the descendants, and they're very happy with me and very grateful that I put the truth out there, and they're my friends.
So what's the? Obviously, again, you're only scratching the surface. You're giving us sound bites, and we've been at it for 2 hours, right? We do need to pack it up in the very near future.
Well, I hope everyone has a very good day. Look, this is my take on it. All I learned when I studied the Jack the Ripper murders, which is this awful van, is that everyone around was amazing. Everyone talks about, the police are corrupt and that witness lied and they try to get in the press. And there's all this thing discounting all the people who are there. But I think people forget the palpable fear where you're just like, fuck, it could be me next.
Yeah.
Or the one I love. And
we have been experienced that fear in the last 12 to 18 months, mate, haven't we?
We're all collectively that it could be me next. That fear, it's palpable.
Yeah.
And to live under that palpable fear, you don't move into a thing where I'm going to make a lot of money and I'm going to start a big conspiracy. I'm going to get a whole bunch of people and kill a bunch of other women because the first one's done by you don't. They were scared, and they were incapable. They were paralyzed by fear most of the time, and just doing something they'd never seen before. A serial killer, someone kills just for the fun of it, who has no pattern, who doesn't have a grudge, isn't doing it because they.
There's none of the traditional motives, revenge, lust, blah, blah, blah.
What do you do first time? New creature. Anyway, I think Thompson thinks he was a new creature on Earth, a diabolical thing that would change the history of the world, and compared himself to Napoleon.
Do you? And this is a couple of little esoteric questions to finish it off. Do you believe that he succeeded in what he set out to do?
Once again, no. I think whatever is Francis Thompson, whatever he wanted to be, is now discolored by my book.
But do you think he was successful in his ritual?
To him.
To him.
Yeah. I don't think someone in Papua New Guinea who's eating probably grapefruit right now around a fire gives a crap about Francis Thompson or Jack the Ripper.
But because in the modern Western world, I mean, we're still fascinated by it today, as you say.
Well,
you know?
if it's just Jack the Ripper, if Jack the Ripper was just a random dude who just went crazy and did no one important, no one we've ever heard of, then it's just an anomaly and interesting. If it's Francis Thompson who happened to be influential, then I think it's our duty to know, since we're teaching kids his writing, we're teaching kids in primary school his poetry today all around the world of a man who possibly killed a whole bunch of people and believe that what you write down influences how people think and behave.
And prove that by creating "If it bleeds, it leads" in the modern press today.
Yeah, I think they said with Francis Thompson that if you scratch the writing, it bleeds.
Which is exactly... Well, man, I did not know where this was going to go. I do need to read your book. I haven't read your book.
Oh, it's okay. Look, 5 people once said they believed me, and everything's fine. There's 5 victims, 5 souls on earth at least said, hey, I'll hold that idea that maybe he did it. And when that happened, I felt like my job was done. I equalised things. So I think it's all good. And we'll all see the funny side of things in the end.
Yeah. So, I mean, again, obviously you're well known in the Ripper circles. Where does your take on it rank in the number of suspects?
I think sometimes I'm 5, sometimes I'm 1, sometimes I'm 14, sometimes 30. Yeah, it just shifts and depends on where you see. But I'm like some newspapers say I'm top 5. You know, big British papers have said that. So I could boast top 5 and show press headlines about that. Yeah, right. So, yeah, and considering before me he was not even mentioned anywhere apart from one publication that went nowhere, unfortunately, before I even knew. A guy found out before me, poor dude.
So another guy had sort of put the pieces together in some way.
A Texan pathologist who's done autopsies on 9,000 corpses, forensic pathologist. So he dealt with crime cases, and he was an expert testimony witness in major high-profile crime cases, murders. He wrote an essay that was published 100 years after the Ripper murders, a century after, exactly as Thompson predicted. As essay in a magazine called The Criminologist, and in that essay, the headline was Francis Thompson Jack the Ripper, and he argued why Thompson could be the Ripper, but what he didn't have, which my research shows, he had a knife, and he was 100 meters away from the last victim. And this guy had everything, prostitute, drugs, his weird writing, his skill. He was a pathologist saying, look, to do the type of wounding, you need to have this expertise. And
you need to know how to cut the nerves and remove those body parts cleanly.
Just not get blood on you where you do that. And Thompson, 6 years, knows how to not get blood on his only bloody doctor suit, Yeah.
So did you speak to that guy? Or was that after your time?
Oh, no. When I came up with my stuff, my theory, 97, I went all over the internet, which was babyish back then, but trying to find anything that anyone else had thought that Francis Thompson was Jack the Ripper, and I had nothing. And nothing, no books or anything. All the books on Thompson just said he was a nice guy. Apart from the biographies, and when you start to look at his actual letters that the biographies are usually based on. And then you look at his unpublished stuff. But anyway, nice guy. And I didn't know that he'd done anything before me until a few years later. And then when I found out, I thought he was dead because it happened so long before me, and he was old at the time. I didn't bother to contact him. I thought if he was interested, he'd get in contact with me. He's older and wiser than me. I've been in the press, I was already, around the world. It's been in the New York press, it's British, India, China, everywhere, at one time. So that's become known. And so I thought if he's not following the Ripper, he would have seen it. So he's not interested. So I won't bother him, thinking he was either dead or not to bother this old guy. But then I called him eventually because I decided maybe he's not dead. Why am I thinking he's dead? He's about 80, 90.
He might still be alive, yeah.
And I called up this old guy who just finished mowing the lawn, who'd retired. And I said, and this and this. And he said that no one in the 20 years since he'd written that had written to him. And he was so disappointed at the lack of response that in this one magazine that he kept the check in a wardrobe. He never spent the check of the money for that essay. I was the first person to ever speak to him about it.
Really?
Like a magic spell. And he puts it down to staunch Catholicism by the editor of the Mirror England at the criminologist. It's a respected journal, criminal journal in England, been around for donkey's years. Actually, my professor at university, because what happened is when I decided he could be Jack the Ripper, I spoke to my tutor at philosophy, and he recommended that I speak to the head of history. And I spoke to the head of history, a man called Professor John Hurst. At the time, I was working on the Republican Party move in 1997 with Steve Izard and that bunch of people. And he said, and like my tutor had said before him, he laughed and said, "No way, Sir Francis Thompson. People get christened with his poems and stuff." He's like, ridiculous, writes about snowflakes and daisies. And I said, "Read my essay and see what you think." And they both got back to me and said, "You're right." And we're talking about the top history professor at La Trobe University. He said, "You've got it. What do you do with that?" And I said, "What do I do with that?" And he said, "Well, there's a thing in England you can write to. There's like a magazine that's interested in stuff. Write to them and see what they think." And I did. I didn't hear anything back from them. And then I got money from people that I didn't know, like checks, cash, all in different languages, letters, and nothing in English, and different currencies. And I stuck me in drawers because I didn't know who they were for. They had my name on it, but I didn't know anything else but that. Anyway, eventually I got one from America that asked for my book because they'd said, this organisation in England had said, apparently devote themselves to solving Jack the Ripper for like almost 50 years. They said that I'd publish a book saying Francis Thompson and Jack the Ripper, which I hadn't even written anything.
Yeah, right. And they were sending you money for the book.
Yeah, different amounts. And I published my home address. They said when they published my home address, people say J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter. You know, people usually have made up monikers to be a writer, so for privacy or whatever. Particularly if you're writing about multiple murder or serial killer. You know, as a writer, I wouldn't want people to have my home address normally.
No.
They published my home address and said, "I've got a book saying Francis Thompson is Jack the Ripper." Now you can imagine what that'd be like if you're a staunch Catholic and really like Francis Thompson.
Yeah.
You know, and
but a percentage of people sent you money.
Yeah, I got a lot of money. And then, so that's why I wrote a book, so I could spend the money they gave me.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, mate, that is, as I said, I don't know where that was going to go tonight. It's definitely a different take. And I do want to read the book. However...
But it's a bit scary.
It's all right. It's as I say, this has been a fascinating experience.
I'm half
for me.
joking. It's just meant to be a gauge. I hope you enjoy the book. It's actually an enjoyable read if you aren't worried about too much of an aftermath, because it's just a story. Whether it's like a Dreamtime thing.
Yeah. Well, man. Thank you for your time. Look, I think I need to read the book. However, I didn't know where this was going to go.
Well, I hoped I surprised you. I tried to keep mum about it.
You did surprise me. And look, actually, I wanted what's one more prophecy that he made that came true?
Okay, just the piece that comes to mind, but there's bigger, more grand ones.
Yeah.
But this is a cute one. He stayed in, how to say he stayed in Patterson Street, the shoemakers. And he wrote a poem, an essay about dolls. When he was a child, he wanted a doll, and his mum wouldn't give him one because the girls got the dolls, and he begged, and finally they gave him a doll, and then they found that he ripped its head off. And when they asked why he was ripping the heads off the dolls, and he called them the princesses, the French princess of the ball, he called it. When they found her with the doll, he said to them, "Well, I've always wanted to know what a beautiful girl's brain's like. I wanted to see what their brains look like, beautiful women." And when the parents punished him for that, he said from there on he realised never to look for brains in a beautiful girl. Yeah, right. And he had this special doll, and he called it the Belle of the Ball. And when he talked about it later, he said that my childhood of her comes to me as an agglomeration of little china fingers, like this porcelain doll, little fingers scuttling towards him, like crab feet from the past, when he thinks of her dead and pulled apart. And what happened in Patterson Street? So Thompson wasn't happy to be a shoemaker. He said at the time, I'm shoemaker for rich business writers who write shit, who write evil things that corrupt the world, and I've got to shine their shoes. This is what he was thinking he wrote about, before the murders, when he was questioned by the police, or someone happened to be questioned by the city police down at Rupert Street, just at the same street at the end, a different name, Okay, so what happens is he said the Patterson Street, 1940 something, 43. There was a guy called Ken Snake Hips Johnson, and he was singing, black dude. He was singing in this pit beneath the shoe shop in 1945. Okay, so 50 years later. Okay, and as he's singing, a bomb falls through the cinema that you see in this big ballroom that is underground, and this ballroom's underground for the elite, the royalty, the best of England go to this nightclub during the war, during the Blitz, underground, and safe because it's under a theatre and deep under the ground. What happens is the German bomb falls through the picture theatre right through into the ballroom, killing everyone pretty much instantly, 40 people. Snake Heaps Johnson gets decapitated, this black guy, and then what happens is that the weird thing is the ballroom was a complete perfect replica. Apparently, I've seen photos of the Titanic ballroom, or the grand stairway of the Titanic. They replicated it to say, yeah, the Titanic sunk. You know, the whole the Catholic stuff didn't work. Here's our bloody Titanic again, and they built the Titanic against the Germans. Okay, right. In a ballroom. That Björk's played there, like famous pulp. You know, they've all played there still. It's big still. Okay, it goes through. This bomb explodes. One didn't explode, just didn't detonate. The second bomb, a twin bomb, in the actual theatre area. The first one, when it exploded, killed 40 people. But when they laid out the bodies, they laid them out along the top, like where the film's shown. You know, that sort of balcony area.
Yeah.
And the man who saw it said all the bodies, because of when they exploded, the bomb exploded, all their clothes are ripped off, and they're not even damaged because it's the force of the bomb.
Shock, yeah, it's the shock.
So
of the
all
bomb,
these, so you got all these pale white bodies naked in a row, male and female, and the author said, the guy, a journalist said, it's weird, but it looks like a conglomeration of little China fingers and bone, hands and feet. And that happened in Thompson. Thompson wrote an essay about, but in his essay he said the bell of the ballroom. He said bell, and it was a French thing. And there was this, I forget the French connection. That sounds weird, but there was this thing about the French thing. All the things in the essay, as you go through the topics, matched the circumstances of the ballroom and the purpose, and the night, what the singer was singing, the song, and it's all really freaky. It's weird synchronicities.
Yeah, right.
It's rabbit holes.
Rabbit holes and rabbit holes. Well, mate, we'll wrap it up. Thanks very much.
No problems. Thanks for the time. I really appreciate it.
No, it's always good, man.
I don't get a chance to chat about this much. You know, I'm a dad and writer, and I do other things, and so it's good to sort of get off my chest now and then.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I'm probably going to read the book and ask you more questions, I would say.
Oh, yeah, that'd be good. And read other books before mine. You should read a book and go, when you read the book, think, as an audience out there, if you're listening and you got a book about Jack the Ripper, read it about that suspect, think to yourself, what's the actual facts, like the evidence that shows that story matches the real stuff. Check it out. Maybe if there's good non-fiction books, there's a great non-fiction book where it's a big, thick book, I forget the name, but it basically has all the police files and documents, and you can just hear the police sides of the story, and they really wanted to catch the Ripper. The police did not want people to die. It was horrible for them to. Yeah, and read them. They're good factual books, not the suspect books. You have a factual book by your side. Yeah.
Well, mate, thanks very much.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah, we got other projects that we got on the board that we'll let people know about in the next little while.
Yeah, we're going to do bigger and better things. But I appreciate people who I don't even know, who maybe aren't, who like I a lot of the time don't feel the best all the time. If you ever want to, if it made you happier today or kept you interested in something to hear tonight, thank you. I'm glad they did that.
And where do people get the book, mate? It's on your website.
Yeah, it's published by a publisher called, what's my publisher's name? Austin Macaulay. It's a British publisher who publishes from the East End, which is cute. And I designed the cover pretty much, or not. I did the hourglass bit. I thought that was cute. The hourglass.
Yeah, right. Fair enough.
I try to have fun with it.
So can you get it online still? Or?
No. I had it for free for 10 years online and not one person downloaded it. I was the first person to have an electronic e-book on a suspect on the internet.
Yeah, right.
On Francis Thompson. It's for free for 10 years and no one was interested. But when I put money sign on it, suddenly people are interested in it.
So where can they buy it?
You can just buy it on Amazon. You can just type Jack the Ripper, the works of Francis Thompson, or Richard Patterson. Yeah, Jack the Ripper, the works of Francis Thompson. It's been bought on Amazon around the world, I think. Or you can buy it through my website, which is, from my website, it's got good stuff on it. Patestos.
Yeah, Patestos.
Yeah, I'm not even going to try to say it, but
Patestos.com.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, I'll post it in the show notes.
Yeah, cool. All right.
Good on you, mate. We'll talk soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Good on you guys.
Thank you very much, Griffin.
Too easy, mate. Thank you.
Appreciate it.